In one of many worlds centuries ago, the heavens opened up and a rift opened between universes. Out of nowhere, horrible dungeons filled with terrible monsters who only wanted to destroy humanity suddenly spread across the entire planet. Most of the monsters were weak, though dangerous, but some were so strong that they could destroy cities with their rage alone. However, with the advent of the dungeons, some people developed unusual abilities that allowed them to resist evil. These heroes, who were called the Awakened, stood up to the monsters and drove them deep into the dungeons, and then began to clear them out as well. People all over the planet who had not received anything supernatural cried from the understanding that the Awakened ones would save them, and there was nothing more to fear. However, in the future, the Awakened were no longer a rarity, and absolutely anyone with enough money could obtain abilities. Being a superhuman became prestigious, and the Awakened could become popular and rich, and therefore the alteration operation was in great demand. People became obsessed with the ghostly chance of becoming rich, and therefore becoming awakened. They immediately rushed to the dungeons, striving to become great as quickly as possible. The state realized that this would lead to problems, and so an official professional exam was adopted to sort out those who could truly become hunters. As a result, educational institutions emerged where the awakened were prepared for the professional exam. Finally, in contrast to state institutions, private institutions emerged, providing a much wider range of educational services. Somewhere in this world, a huge dragon-like monster tightly grabbed the stump of its arm with its second paw, looking in panic at the one who had just cut it off. With one hand in his pocket, the awakened one stood before the dragon, armed with a shining spear whose blade was sharper than obsidian. Horrified at how a human could be so strong, the dragon looked at the kind smile of the awakened one, asking if his enemy was a simple frog. Roaring in fury, the dragon swung its own tail, preparing to finish off its insolent opponent in refusal to accept its own defeat. However, the boy easily jumped up, dodging the powerful attack and with calmness in his eyes, preparing to attack himself. The dragon tried to intercept the enemy and kill him with a powerful blow of its claws, threatening to tear the enemy to pieces. But the awakened one dodged this attack with a light and lightning-fast movement, and then swung his spear, striking the dragon right in the face with amazing power. Landing quickly, the boy swung his spear again, cutting into the dragon's body, which growled in pain. In desperation, the monster began to focus dark energy into the air, intending to use it for its most powerful attack. His roar, passing through the sphere of this energy, turned into an incredibly powerful pillar of dark flame, which threatened to burn the enemy to the ground. The guy, smiling and throwing his spear over his shoulder, was ready to accept this attack, clearly not afraid of being burned, but on the contrary, was going to win this clearly unfair fight. Remembering which academy he himself was going to enroll in, the boy aimed the tip of his spear at the very center of the fiery pillar. And just a minute later, smiling contentedly, the guy moved away from the corpse of the dragon-like monster, thinking about how great it would be to study at the academy. Hearing the notification sound, the guy took out his phone and happily looked at the screen, which contained all the information about his future classes. A window popped up on the screen asking the guy if he wanted to sign up for the class, and he didn't even think about the answer and boldly pressed the positive answer button. Meanwhile, in one of the work areas, a guy named Roy, sweating from the effort, stubbornly carried out the task set before him. Being awakened from birth, the boy had more talent than others, but now he was forced to work to pay off the debts of his deceased parents. For 9 long years, he worked for a company that transported monsters killed by hunters. Wiping the floor off his face, Roy thought for the umpteenth time in a long time that only his dream of becoming a hunter himself was keeping him going. Having completed another task, Roy went to his older comrades, who suggested that he take a break and asked how his target was going. Opening a can of soda, the guy said that he was trying, but finding a cheap enough academy wasn't that easy, to which his comrades thoughtfully supported him. Roy imagined the mighty hunters who taught at the academy, and thought with a slightly sad smile how good it would be to study with them. He also thought sadly that the difference between those who graduated from the academy and the uneducated awakened was simply unimaginable. However, his sadness immediately left him when he looked at his phone screen with a smile, and noted that he finally had enough money for a whole year of study. The The guy, beaming with happiness, thought that he would, of course, like to go to a better institution, but he only had enough money for the cheapest academy. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to an advertisement window, which spoke of some Academy of Transcendence, which Roy had never heard of before. After pressing the button, the boy saw a video that said that this Transcendence Academy was taught by teachers who were over 10,000 years old. With a surprised look, Roy looked at the guy who was giving an interview, telling him that entering the Transcendent Academy was the best decision of his life. In the video, a whole bunch of students thanked the Academy for teaching them, and after the caption that Roy could also enroll now, the screen suddenly turned off. Staring at the switched-off screen in shock, Roy voiced the thought that this advertisement was created by some lunatic, after which he went to the Academy's website and read information about it. Surprised that the names of the teachers were the names of legendary characters and heroes, Roy pressed the button next to the name of the teacher of the basics of mastering the staff and spear, and the face of a small monkey appeared in front of him. Having hit himself in the face with his palm, the guy even laughed at the fact that some monkey started talking about the basics of wielding a spear, and introduced herself as the hero of Chinese legends Sun Wukong. However, looking up at the phone screen, the guy noticed that the activity the monkey was showing looked quite normal. Suddenly, the teacher's cartoonish appearance faded, and Roy saw the strong muscles rolling under the skin of the master's hand as he swung his staff. When Sun Wukong twirled the staff in his hands and then grabbed it with both hands, the boy saw that he now really did look like the legendary monkey god. Roy watched in amazement as the teacher slashed forward with a deft and powerful blow at the stone mountain, causing it to crumble into huge stone fragments. Looking at the screen in amazement, the guy noticed that even the fragments had crumbled into dust. And in his head, there was only one question. How did the monkey manage to hit like that? Roy jumped up from his seat, wondering if the video was CGI, but realized it wasn't, and then pointed out that even S-class hunters couldn't do that. When the video ended, the guy saw a notification asking if he wanted to sign up for the class, and after thinking about it, he agreed. However, the program showed an error, indicating that he was not in the academy, and then calculated the cost of tuition, taking into account his situation, which was 40,000, which was his entire budget. The guy narrowed his eyes in surprise, not understanding how the program could calculate everything so that the training would cost all his money. When the guy decided to take a break from his thoughts and continue working, one of his older friends asked him if he was going to enroll in the academy. While loading the guy's stretcher with the corpses of monsters, he noticed that the guy was quite happy today, which meant that his guess was most likely correct. Stepping slightly to the side, the man began using the lift to move the corpse of a particularly large monster, and heard Roy talking about a place called the Ark. The guy even offered the man to clean up the corpses of the monsters after him, to which the man laughed and made Roy promise to get him a dragon. The awakened one moved on, staring at the ground and thinking about the future while the lift worked above his head. But at the same moment as he found himself directly under the corpse of a huge monster, the chain holding him in the air suddenly snapped. The huge monster began to fall right on Roy, and he only managed to turn around at his comrade's shout when the body pressed him to the ground, causing him to lose consciousness. After a long period of treatment, Roy, lying in the hospital, with a hunted look in his eyes, talked about everything that had happened. Doctors told him that his broken leg bone, due to its super-fast regeneration, was entangled with nerves and had become necrotic. Concerned about his reputation, the owner of the company Roy worked for refused to pay compensation, saying it was not his fault. He was told that the operation to save his leg would cost all his savings, and it had to be done quickly. So the boy had no choice, and only his older friend from work, having come to visit Roy, gave him 3,000, which was all that he had left. After the operation, the guy sat in his room with his leg in a cast, thinking about how cruelly fate had treated him. Clutching the money his friend had given him in despair, Roy thought that he had nothing left at all, and that he had wasted 9 years of hellish labor. Looking into the void with a hopeless look, the guy was wondering if he had enough willpower to save up this money again, when his phone suddenly rang. Looking at the screen and picking up the phone, the boy saw notifications of advertisements from the Academy of Transcendence, telling him about a new offer for him. After clicking the notification button, Roy saw the program start calculating his membership fee, which this time was only 3,000, which surprised the guy quite a bit. Clutching the phone in his hand, the boy began to doubt, thinking that this academy was going to take all his savings. And although this was all the money he had, Roy decided that he had nothing left to lose anyway. And so he answered yes to the question of whether he wanted to join the academy. And when he did this, the program confirmed his membership. And then the money from the envelope lying next to him suddenly began to fly into the air, which greatly surprised the guy himself. The program congratulated him on joining the academy, and then the screen turned off and glowed purple, and suddenly some strange little boy appeared from it. The guy looked in shock at the little man who greeted him and couldn't understand how someone could get out of his phone. When the kid said that he was Roy's mentor and would help him with his studies, the boy decided that he had hit his head. And although Roy did not answer him at all, wondering if everything that was happening was a dream, the kid said that mentor is not only a position, but also a name. Standing happily on the phone screen, the kid waited for questions with a smile, looking at the guy with big eyes. Roy at this time clearly looked stunned, and therefore did not understand what the kid told him and asked his name again, refusing to understand how a mentor could also be called mentor. Obviously enjoying the sound of this word, the baby repeated several times that he was Roy's mentor, and that his name was Mentor. The boy suddenly thought about it and asked if the little boy was the same mentor who taught Odysseus, one of the greatest heroes of Greek mythology. The kid confirmed Roy's guess and said that Odysseus was his first student, and after becoming a transcendent, he still sometimes contacts his former teacher. After clearing his throat, Mentor began to speak seriously and explained that the Academy of Transcendence trains those who want to go beyond the limits of their race. Suddenly, raising his eyebrows in surprise, the guy asked directly if the Academy wasn't a place for training hunters, which surprised Mentor. Smiling, the kid noted that hunters and transcendents cannot be compared at all, because they are on completely different levels. While the kid was pressing something on the screen, Roy tried to object and point out that S-class hunters were still very strong. But the kid interrupted him. Handing the boy the phone, the kid said that the academy instructors could handle any hunter with one finger, and therefore he needed to fill out some information. Scratching the back of his head, the guy looked at the screen, which displayed some strange test, and the mentor explained that it was to check his inclinations and determine his level. Looking at the screen, the guy saw many areas of study, but he himself was more impressed by boy, and therefore he decided that he would study in this particular area. Suddenly he got stuck on the second question and told mentor straight out that he had no idea what to answer, because it asked about his level, and the minimum answer was that he could rip a mountain out of the ground. The mentor tried to help and asked if he could do it, clearly expecting the guy to answer positively. But Roy just shook his head. The kid looked shocked, because he clearly didn't expect his charge to be such a clumsy person. And while the clearly embarrassed guy was trying to figure out how to answer, Mentor was trying to understand how Roy was accepted into the academy in the first place. However, sighing and smiling, the kid noted that there was definitely no need to worry, because the academy that accepted the student would never expel him. After about an hour, Roy finally finished, and he was clearly exhausted because answering a whole 108 questions was very difficult, and Mentor boldly praised him. Having looked into the guy's phone, Mentor immediately suggested that he attend a few basic lectures later, but for now, he should look at his profile. Looking at the answers, the kid noted that if Roy preferred to use the spear, he should switch from mana cultivation to the Eastern technique of ki. Thinking that the guy, among other things, had mental problems, Mentor suggested that Roy take advantage of a lesson from a certain Siddhartha Gautama. Roy was speechless when he realized that this instructor was none other than Buddha himself, the founder of the Buddhism movement. The mentor noted with a grin that Buddha was very famous for his lectures on psychology, and therefore his subject was required for the Transcendence exam. Looking at the screen, the boy saw that the reward for studying the lesson was something called an unwavering heart, and the mentor noted that thanks to this, he would succeed in everything else. The mentor added that there was no way around it, and therefore Roy should watch the lecture to the very end, even if it seemed like he was going crazy. Having left the necessary instructions, Mentor began to disappear, saying at the end that he would return later, but for now he would study Roy's profile. Looking around and realizing that Mentor had completely disappeared, the guy scratched the back of his head and thought that he would still have to learn this lesson. Frowning in uncertainty, The boy opened the program and prepared to watch a video that could drive him crazy. At the same moment, the face of a man, similar to the statues of Buddha, appeared on the screen, asking whether our world exists. Watching the video, the guy thought that this Gautama even looked too much like how he is depicted in statues and pictures. Sitting under a tree, Buddha, with his eyes closed, reasoned that the word I did not exist, and therefore he himself could not exist. The man crossed his legs and looked like he was full of peace, while at the same time he was wondering how something that could not be defined could exist. Roy tried to focus on Buddha's words, but found his mind straining with the difficult information to process. After listening to information that was difficult for the mind to comprehend for a long time, Roy felt completely exhausted, although he had only listened to 0.06% of the lecture. A week later, Roy felt so good that he was able to stand on both legs, and his body became stronger, which greatly surprised the doctors. The guy felt great, and at the same time he understood that Buddha's lectures had had a strong influence on his well-being. Gautama's wisdom filled his heart with peace, which increased the speed of his body's recovery, although the boy realized that listening to lectures was incredibly difficult. The guy listened to the lectures only 1.3%, but the result was already very high, and he was very interested in what would happen next. Deciding to play it safe, the doctor asked Roy to stay in the hospital for another week, and the guy himself was only happy. Lying in his bed and thinking that he could watch the second lecture offered by the mentor, the guy noticed that for the wisdom of Buddha, a skill is given that is much better than most others. Deciding that he needed to study further, the boy turned on the video of the second teacher, and a bearded face of a creature named Chiron appeared on the screen. Chiron was a centaur, and not just any centaur, but a mentor to most of the most famous heroes of Greek mythology. Raising one of the horse's legs, the centaur, looking at the audience with a firm gaze, said that the purpose of this lecture was to prepare students for the early stage of transcendence. He said that the martial techniques in this lecture would be covered superficially, and Roy was surprised at that time that the legendary Chiron himself would teach him. The centaur spoke calmly and judiciously, and so Roy watched his lecture quite relaxed. But Chiron began to talk about what needed to be done first. The legendary teacher suddenly bared his teeth and ground his teeth, which surprised Roy a little. And then the centaur took a deep breath. Suddenly, Chiron screamed at Roy to get up and go, his eyes blazing with a fury that was hard to imagine. The guy was so surprised by the unexpected change in the mood of the lecture that he even dropped the phone, from the speakers of which the centaur's voice was shouting. After hearing this, the guy even lost his sense of reality for a moment. Due to the surprise, the guy even fell out of bed, and his phone landed on the soft carpet and vibrated. Getting up from the floor and picking up his phone, Roy saw that a very difficult physical task had appeared on the screen, requiring him to complete a very difficult standard of athletic exercises. Remembering that even the doctor had told him not to overexert himself, Roy thought hard about whether it was worth carrying out the task at all now. Yawning and giving in to his own laziness, the guy decided that he would practice later, and now he would just listen to the lectures. But the program did not allow him to do this. Roy was very surprised to realize that he would not be able to listen to the lecture until he completed the task. And this did not make him happy at all. He kept pressing the button to start the lecture, but the program wouldn't let him do it, which surprised Roy because he didn't understand how they would know about his successes. In the end, the guy bowed his head and sighed hopelessly, realizing that he definitely wouldn't be allowed to watch the lecture today. Roy closed his eyes in disappointment, and then thought that there was no point in driving himself, so it would be better not to do Chiron's tasks this week. Taking out his phone, he decided to continue watching Buddha's lectures, but noticed an inscription that he had not seen before. He saw that the lectures were only open to him for a while, and so he had to force himself to get up and go carry out Chiron's assignments. While warming up, Roy reasoned that the fact that not everything comes for free is quite logical, and therefore he will have to try to work for his money. A couple of days later, Roy noticed that progress was not always recorded after listening to Buddha's lectures, which meant he might not make it in time for the limited period. While stretching his shoulder, the guy thought that he hadn't trained for a long time, because until that moment, he didn't even see the point in training. Remembering that he had previously done physical labor, the guy decided that this was precisely why he had not trained. Roy remembered the strain of carrying the heavy corpses of the monsters, and decided that this load would be enough to keep him in shape. Doing push-ups over and over again, the guy confidently pushed off the ground, thinking that his awakening would definitely help him complete the task perfectly. Eventually, all 300 push-ups were over, and Roy stood up contentedly, looking at his phone screen to check if the task had been confirmed. However, at that very moment, the guy was very surprised, because the phone screen showed that out of 300, he had only done 81 push-ups. He did another push-up and looked at the screen, but the number of exercises he had completed had not changed at all. He tried to do it again, straining his arms hard, and the number finally changed, pleasing the guy. Having risen, he looked at the screen again and froze in place, realizing what the problem was and not at all happy. Throwing himself to the ground, the guy continued doing push-ups, this time properly, hissing through clenched teeth that he hadn't done them perfectly before. Pulling himself up with great difficulty, the boy growled that every time he did a task even a little bit incorrectly, the completed task would no longer count. Through the pain, the guy forced himself to complete the tasks perfectly. Although, because of this, his body experienced incredible stress. Having gone outside in the morning and worked out all day, the guy finished his run in the evening, which is why his whole body ached with pain. Trying to ignore the disapproving whispers of those around him, Roy collapsed exhausted on the ground. Not understanding when he should listen to lectures, the guy nevertheless forced himself to train every day until exhaustion. And after 2 days, people began to notice his progress. Dressed in a tracksuit once again, Roy headed off to training, meeting a nice grandmother along the way and deciding to exchange a few words with her. While the grandmother was bragging that she herself worked tirelessly, the boy listened to her with a smile, noticing the TV with the news. After talking with his grandmother, Roy looked up, looked at the TV screen, and heard about the appearance of a 4th-level giant. The guy chuckled and learned that the giant was in hibernation and could now pose a danger. It turned out that he was considered a corpse and dragged to the center of the city, and by pure chance there was a strong awakened nearby who dealt with the monster. It turned out that the grandmother also paid attention to the news, and now noted that she was glad that the hunters could save them. Suddenly, the grandmother remembered that Roy himself was an awakened one, and asked the boy if she remembered everything correctly. Having confirmed his grandmother's thoughts, the guy suddenly saw her smile and heard that she would like to see him on TV one day, after which she shook his hand. And although he was tempted by this, the guy couldn't help but admit that he would hardly ever be shown on the news because he was not a professional hunter. Suddenly, a sullen man turned to them, also watching the news and hearing every detail of their friendly conversation. The man noted, not without malice, that times had changed, and it was incredibly difficult to become a hunter now, surprising his grandmother, who had completely failed to keep up with modern trends. Looking at Roy with displeasure, the man noted that he would hardly ever become a hunter, even if he was awakened. The man grinned sarcastically and said that he wasn't even a member of the academy, and therefore his training was absolutely in vain, and it would be better to give up. Roy thought gloomily of all the years of work he had put into becoming a professional hunter someday. Anger at the harmful man flashed in his eyes, and he was about to tell him everything he thought about him. But he didn't have time. Without giving the boy a chance to say a word, the grandmother pounced on the man with reproaches, indignant at how dare he say such nasty things to such a sweet young man. The guy angrily clenched his fists and quietly noted that this was his life, which meant he would live it only the way he wanted. To which the man angrily jumped up from his seat. He tried to put Roy in his place, saying that he had lived a long life and knew what was right. But the guy interrupted him and insisted that he should continue living his life and leave the guy alone. The impudent man suddenly lost his power of speech and looked at the angry Roy in bewilderment, thinking that he had probably gone too far. But as soon as the boy turned around and walked away, the man shouted that Roy didn't dare talk to his elders like that, while the grandmother scolded the rude old man. Roy, meanwhile, moved away, determined to move on along his life's path, not listening to those who knew nothing about him. Looking ahead gloomily, the boy thought that he would definitely become a hunter, because in just a week he had felt the incredible effect of training at the Transcendent Academy. Running kilometer after kilometer, straining every muscle in his body, the guy steadfastly moved forward, keeping in mind the thought that he would definitely reach his goal. At the same time, somewhere else, the girl who was the awakened one sighed sullenly, noting that she was very tired of being a hunter. She stood right in front of the monster that was rushing at her in a furious attack, placing her hand on the hilt of her sword and wondering why the academy she was studying at even existed. With a slight movement of her hands, the girl snatched the blade from its sheath and attacked the monster, cutting it in half without much difficulty, and not stopping to calmly reason. Standing on top of the pile of bodies of lion-like monsters, the girl put her hand on her hip and whined discontentedly, noting that the life of a hunter was incredibly boring. Finally, after 2 long weeks, the guy returned to his house, and the first thing he did was collapse into his bed, happy that he was finally home. Pressing his face into the bed, the boy noted that he had been terribly homesick during all the time he had been in the hospital and devoting himself to studying. Suddenly, Roy felt sad and thought about how exactly he had spent his time these past 2 weeks, and also how soon he would finally reach his goal. Relaxing his muscles, the boy remembered that the hunter's exam would be in a year, which meant that he had limited time to prepare, although there was a lot of it. With a heavy sigh and an equally heavy look around the apartment, the guy realized that he had absolutely no means of subsistence for this time. Having decided to distract himself from sad thoughts, the guy took out his phone and looked at the screen, remembering that he had just recently completed another task. For the first time in a long time, Roy was able to take a break from the difficult tasks and watch another lecture from Chiron, who seemed to be waiting for his new student. Hearing Chiron praise the boy for learning to walk, Roy grumbled in displeasure, thinking that his mentor considered him a child. Smiling contentedly, the centaur armed himself with his spear and noted that it was time to start taking the first steps in that case. Chiron stretched his neck and looked seriously from the screen straight into Roy's eyes and said that it was time for the boy to understand how feelings worked. The next day, having completed 5.7% of the lecture, Roy made it to his desk where his boss scolded him for taking too long a break. Roy cast a disgruntled glance at his departing boss and noted that, although he had not paid compensation, the man clearly felt a little guilty. Sitting in the pose of a thinker in the restroom, Roy thought about how he would manage to combine work and study. Straining all his brain, the guy tried to figure out how to get out of the situation, because if he didn't complete the tasks, he wouldn't be able to listen to Chiron's lectures. After thinking about it, the guy couldn't even remember what Chiron had said in the last lecture. But he definitely remembered something about feelings when his older friend entered the room. Roy began to remember Chiron giving basic information about the 5 basic human senses as the man approached the boy from behind. Chiron explained that first a person perceives a stimulus, then recognizes it, and then draws conclusions. But this takes too long, and therefore he will teach Roy new skills. Looking sternly into the guy's eyes, Chiron tells a story about something that is different from these 5 senses, although it is a continuation of them, and that is hidden inside every person. Roy remembered that the centaur had told him about the 6th sense, which turned out to be intuition, and which would help a person overcome his basic capabilities. The man who came up from behind tried to butt his friend in the shoulder with his hand in a friendly manner and back up the gesture with a good joke, but Roy, unexpectedly even for himself, dodged. Roy rose from his seat, and his older comrade asked in amazement if his young friend had grown eyes in the back of his head. With the situation forgotten in the friendly atmosphere, the friends returned to work, and the man frowned when Roy asked to load him with more. Roy, who had been training for a long time, asked his friend not to worry and to boldly give him even more weight, although the man was afraid that the recently sick guy would suddenly overexert himself. Surprised by his own new strength, the guy walked boldly across the work area, effortlessly carrying 200 kilograms of meat on his back, and his older comrade looked after the boy in amazement, not understanding how the recently sick young man had suddenly become so strong. But I had to admit that the guy was okay, which meant there was no need to worry about him, until the shift supervisor shouted to everyone, announcing a break. Moving forward calmly with a large weight, the boy looked at his hands and felt that even with such a burden, his body was filled with strength, which was surprising. Having heard about the announcement of a break, the guy decided to at least complete the daily task, because after the shift, he definitely wouldn't have time. After sitting down once, the guy took out his phone and looked at the screen, wanting to see if he was doing everything right. Having turned on the program, The guy even opened his eyes in surprise when he looked at the statistics of the task completion. The guy realized that one of his squats was counted as 3 because of the extra weight, and started doing the calculations while his older friend called Roy to take a rest. Suddenly, he exclaimed triumphantly, rejoicing that he would be able to fulfill the norm very quickly if he did it with additional weight, which greatly surprised his comrade. Having loaded himself to the maximum, Roy, despite the protests of his older comrade, began to fulfill the daily quota, giving his all. Impressing his friend, Roy began doing push-ups, loading himself up with a whole 200 extra kilograms, wanting to become stronger as quickly as possible and free up time for himself after his shift at the lecture. And yet, after such hard and diligent work, the guy was incredibly tired. And therefore, having reached home, he immediately rushed into bed to get a good rest. And while the weight training was very effective, Roy couldn't help but admit that it was also 3 times harder. Getting out of bed, the guy looked at the screen and was pleased to note that the task was completed in full, which meant he had successfully saved time. A couple of hours later, looking at the time, the guy noticed that he had managed to listen to both lectures by 10 o'clock. And, although he had tried very hard, Roy felt that he was wasting time. It suddenly occurred to him that he could enroll in one more class now that he had some free time. After scrolling through the page with various items and mentors, Roy saw a lecture on increasing strength under the supervision of a master named Xiang Yu. Roy was quite surprised, remembering that Xiang Yu was a Chinese general who crushed the Qin dynasty and was known as the hegemon king due to his mighty strength. Rubbing his chin, the guy thought, remembering that it was about him that it was said that he would go alone against 7. As soon as the guy confirmed his desire to get acquainted with the military leader's course, he saw him laughing at the weakness of the guy who decided to enroll in it. The boy frowned when he heard the legendary hero dragging him through the mud, calling him a worthless person who couldn't even lift a rock. However, apparently taking pity on the poor fellow, Xiang Yu waved his spear and, stopping laughing, promised with a smile to teach his protege how to truly wield his spear. Smiling ominously, the hegemon king noted that there was no point in listening to the pathetic Sun Wukong. And if Roy really wanted to learn how to use a spear, let him at least pick it up. Only a few seconds had passed since the lecture, but it was already over. And Roy had received a new daily task of swinging his spear a whopping 5,000 times. Roy sat on the floor, stunned and disappointed, wondering how Xiang Yu could even be a teacher if his lectures only took a few seconds. Looking at the new task, the guy fell onto the bed, indignant at why all the daily tasks were always so stupid. The next day, the production manager suddenly came to the work area, to whom Roy's boss reported on every action. Looking sternly at her subordinate, the girl reminded him that the other day one of the monsters turned out to be alive, and therefore they should conduct a more thorough check of each killed monster. Trembling with excitement, Roy's boss agreed with her and promised that her orders would be carried out, much to the surprise of his own subordinates. While the workers were whispering about their boss, Roy, having gained weight again, was working hard to free up time for training. Walking serenely through the grounds, the boy heard the whispers of his colleagues, saying that their manager seemed to be named Aura Bauer from a famous family. The guy remembered that it was from this family that the most famous hunter-swordsman in history came. Roy remembered being told that in the very first days of the monster's appearance, the monsters roamed the cities unhindered, killing everyone in their path. And it was Guy Bauer, being one of the very first awakened, who stood up against the monsters, protecting everyone he could find. He turned out to be the one who gave humanity hope for salvation and did not allow human civilization to disappear, and therefore was known throughout the world. And although much time has passed since then, and Guy has grown old, the hero still remained a true professional, always ready to compete with anyone. The guy thought about the person who had come to his work area today, and then sighed. And then he boldly continued to walk with a huge weight, doing a squat and a step for the 40th time and significantly surprising Aura, who was passing by. The girl gave Roy an appraising look and asked the facility manager who the guy was, and the man asked her to ignore him, saying that he had been like that for a week. Having decided that the guy was not all there, the girl went on, not interfering with Roy's training, without being distracted from the hard work. Approaching his senior comrade, Roy decided to throw off the corpses in order to go and get new ones, making the last 60th squat in a step. While the guy was squatting and throwing off the load, his friend asked when he would calm down. But the guy said that he would not stop. Having finally thrown off his burden, the guy felt a great sense of relief and happily told his friend that these training sessions were quite beneficial. The older comrade grinned, shaking his head as he wondered when his comrade would relax. But he knew that it was unlikely to happen. At the same moment, one whole corpse behind the man suddenly twitched, which he was unable to notice. However, Roy was able to, and cast a worried glance at his comrade, who could now be in great danger. Suddenly, although wounded and with several severed limbs, the huge lion-like monster soared into the sky, drenching the two friends with the wind from the flapping of its mighty wings. With its mouth wide open and a terrifying roar, the monster rushed at the man standing nearby, intending to tear him to pieces. Seeing this, Roy screamed his friend's name in panic, trying to warn him of the danger. Meanwhile, Aura Bauer was finally able to relax a little and sighed, catching her breath after a long inspection of her facility. Leaning her back against the vertical beam, the girl indignantly noted that this facility manager was too clingy and had completely gotten on her nerves. Looking gloomily at the object, the girl thought about how much longer she would have to endure this work. While one of the workers glanced at her from the side, suddenly the girl heard the much-hated nickname of the great swordsman's granddaughter from the lips of the whispering workers near her. The girl closed her eyes indignantly and listened to the workers discussing her person with unpleasant meticulousness, thinking that she couldn't hear. They allowed themselves to make an unpleasant comment that the girl looked weak for the granddaughter of a legendary swordsman, and the girl sighed, trying to control herself. Although Aura had trained since childhood, trying to keep up with her grandfather's fame, she could never reach his greatness, which became an incredible burden for the girl. And although the girl studied hard and then worked as a hunter, she could not get the thought out of her head about how much she wanted to become a teacher. And although it was her life, and Aura had the right to dream and make her dreams come true, her grandfather didn't want to listen, forcing her to follow her own path. The girl was still able to compromise with Guy, and with his help, founded a hunter academy. But even there, she remained only the granddaughter of the great swordsman. People thought that the great swordsman Guy would teach them, but when they found out that the teacher would only be his granddaughter, they grumbled with discontent, thinking that they had been deceived. And although at first there were indeed many people who wanted to study, they all wanted to see only Guy Bauer as a teacher. But not finding what they wanted, everyone left, and the girls' academy lost the entire flow of students that it had at the beginning. Realizing that she was absolutely of no use to anyone, the girl despaired and doubted her dream. As she walked through the work area, the girl remembered how much she had always wanted to teach, and how easily she had been deprived of the opportunity to do so. She sighed hopelessly and thought that she was just one gifted student away from realizing her dream and reviving the academy. But as she was speaking, one of the workers suddenly ran forward and fell to his knees, screaming in panic for everyone to run away and save themselves. The girl's eyes widened in shock when she heard from the worker that one of the monsters was alive and was now threatening people. At this time, the monster had already managed to knock down Roy's older friend and was growling, standing over him, while the guy was trying to figure out what to do. Gritting his teeth from adrenaline, the guy tried to understand how the monster could be alive, since he himself was dragging its corpse. The boy's friend suddenly screamed, demanding that Roy run as fast as he could and leave him. And although the guy understood that he needed to run away from danger, he was absolutely sure that in that case his comrade would be killed, and therefore he could not move from the spot. The guy opened his eyes wide, trying to pull himself together, but the understanding of the danger of the situation paralyzed his entire body. Looking at the monster, the guy reasoned, realizing that without magic, he would hardly be able to defeat such a strong, albeit wounded, monster. He remembered that Aura Bauer should be somewhere nearby, and she would definitely be able to kill the monster. And although the hope for her help flashed in his mind, the spark immediately went out when he realized that by the time she got there, his friend would already be killed. Paralyzed with fear, Roy watched as the monster walked around the lying man and tried to think of some way out of the situation. While he was gathering his mind into one whole, the monster, opening its mouth, rushed at the defenseless man, intending to bite him. Roy, without expecting it from himself, suddenly grabbed an iron rod from the ground and waved his hand, preparing to rush forward. And just a moment later, raising the rod, Throwing fear out of his head and listening to the rage seething in his mind, the guy rushed into the attack, intending to protect his comrade. Running closer, he swung his improvised weapon, forcing the monster to take a step back from its defenseless prey. The man tried to say something, but Roy interrupted him and demanded that he run while he could hold off the monster. The brave comrade said that he would not dare to abandon his friend, but Roy cried out that in that case they would both die, and therefore he had better run away before it was too late. Gripping the rod tighter, the guy clenched his teeth and cast a furious glance at the enemy, wondering how he could now save himself. Looking into the monster's eyes full of anger, the boy thought only about whether he would be able to hold out long enough until the hunters came. Feeling a real animal horror, the guy began to concentrate, forcing his mind to remain calm. Suddenly, the boy heard the velvety voice of Buddha, dispelling his fear and convincing Roy that he was the universe. Roy felt surprisingly calm and relaxed, and it was as if a flow of energy surrounded him, permeating everything around him. And while the guy was focusing, the monster growled gutturally, getting ready to have a good feast on its rival. The boy breathed deeply, imagining Buddha himself standing behind him, supporting Roy and helping him merge with the world around him. Buddha told him to put aside his emotions, and at that very moment the monster, pushing off with its powerful hind legs, rushed forward, intending to close its jaws on the boy's neck. In turn, Roy calmly twirled the rod in his hand and, closing his eyes, breathed deeply, calming his mind. Without expecting it from himself, the boy calmed his emotions and allowed his body to move, rushing forward to intercept the monster's attack. The monster, with a look full of fury, threw back its paw, preparing to tear the enemy apart. And Roy, calmly raising his head, grabbed the iron rod more tightly. Suddenly, the guy heard Chiron's voice right next to his ear, as if the centaur was standing behind the guy, urging the guy not to think, but to move, because thinking can slow him down. Trusting his instincts, the boy tilted his head back, effortlessly dodging the deadly attack. Just as easily, the boy let his body move further and jumped, turning in the air and tearing the distance between himself and the monster. Realizing that the enemy was unexpectedly fast, the monster tried to swing its tail to reach the enemy. Not allowing himself to think for more than a second, the boy planted the pole on the ground and deftly dodged the tail attack. Suddenly, even for himself, finding himself in the air, the monster suddenly shook its head, trying to understand where its enemy, who was moving surprisingly quickly, had gone so unexpectedly. Being above the monster's head, Roy realized that this was his blind spot, meaning he had an advantage over his enemy. And although Roy knew perfectly well that now was the time to attack, he couldn't figure out how exactly he should do it. At that very moment, he felt the presence of the hegemon king nearby, claiming that strength was not enough, and sometimes courage and zeal were needed. Feeling the stern gaze of the great warrior on himself, Roy heard him tell him to trust himself, and not to dare doubt his strength and ability to even move a mountain. Listening to his mentor, the boy tightly gripped the improvised weapon and swung it properly, preparing to attack. Moving towards the monster, the guy, opening his eyes, firmly told himself that he would be able to cut it down. Looking from above, he corrected himself, saying that he could not, but simply had to do it that way. As the boy approached the enemy with incredible speed, the monster suddenly raised its head, clearly noticing the imminent attack of its opponent. The monster raised its muzzle and opened its jaws, preparing to bite the guy in half. Concentrating the fortitude of his mind, the strength of his body, and the faith in the ability to cut the monster down, the boy swung the rod and struck from top to bottom with all his strength. The blow was so precise that it certainly reached its target, causing incredible damage to the monster's body. And as soon as the guy landed after this blow, an incredibly powerful explosion sounded around him, as if a stick of TNT had been detonated. While the surrounding people looked at the battlefield in shock, Aura quickly came running, asking what was going on here. She looked around the scene of the battle with a surprised look, trying to focus her gaze and see what was happening there. Roy stood in the middle of a cloud of dust, breathing heavily and clutching the iron rod he had just used to attack the monster. And right behind his back, striking everyone, including Aura with its appearance, lay a monster cut into two parts, struck by Roy's incredibly powerful attack. And although the guy's body was tense, his gaze showed for sure that the guy's mind was absolutely calm. But a second later, he opened his eyes in surprise, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Turning to the corpse of the monster, the boy scratched the back of his head, not understanding how he was suddenly able to deal with it while his phone vibrated with notifications about successful training progress. Staring in amazement ahead, the girl tried to comprehend what had just happened here while she was not looking. She tried to understand how some loader, not a student at the academy and armed with only an iron rod, managed to cope with such a strong monster. The guy suddenly remembered what exactly had pushed him to such a desperate act and focused his gaze in front of him. Still clutching the weapon in his hand, the boy quickly walked past Aura to his older comrade, worried about his condition. While the girl looked at him in surprise, Roy excitedly asked his friend how he was feeling, but he just waved it off. And although Roy desperately insisted that his friend visit the hospital, the workers embraced him in a friendly hug and began congratulating him on his major victory. Still not taking her eyes off the guy, the girl thought for a moment, then sighed and said that it seemed like he could become her best student. When the shift ended, the boss made the workers promise to keep quiet about what happened, and Roy convinced his friend to visit the hospital, intending to get home as quickly as possible. Walking towards the house, the guy took out his phone and looked at the screen, raising his eyebrows in surprise. Seeing that the progress of all 3 lectures had increased, the boy thoughtfully noted that this was probably because he had used the knowledge and defeated the monster. The guy realized that practice would help him increase his learning progress and absorb all the information as best as possible. But a couple of problems still remained. Roy grumbled out loud that he needed a license to practice, and the Academy of Transcendence wouldn't give him one, which meant he had to save up for training again. Suddenly, he heard Aura's ringing voice calling out to him from behind him. The girl stepped forward and asked the guy to pay attention to her, and he remembered who she was. The guy shrugged his shoulders, agreed, and asked what she wanted. And the girl spoke seriously, suggesting that they get straight to the point. Taking a step forward, she seriously asked if Roy would like to meet her grandfather, the great swordsman. The guy didn't even think about it and shrugged his shoulders again, indifferently noting that he wasn't interested in it at all. The girl had already agreed to introduce them, but after a couple of seconds, the meaning of his words reached her, and she opened her eyes in shock, watching as the guy walked away. The girl introduced herself properly and laid out her real proposal to the guy, wanting Roy to join her academy. However, Roy, after some reflection, sternly noted that there was not a single student in her academy, and therefore it was an academy only on paper. The girl looked at the guy in shock as he was about to leave and tried to convince him that they had everything they needed to train him, although the guy was not interested. In the end, the girl even compromised her principles and offered to persuade her grandfather to teach him. However, Roy, again indifferently shrugging his shoulders, again told the girl that he was not at all interested in meeting the great swordsman. The girl tried to think of at least one way to detain the guy and convince him to go with her, and therefore reminded him that he would also have to pass a written exam. Roy shook his head at this too. Then the girl said that he could go into battle against monsters right now, but he had no right to do so without a license. Roy sternly pointed out that her makeshift academy would not be able to give him a license, but the girl desperately exclaimed that she actually had the right to issue licenses. Hearing these words, the guy slowed down and clicked his tongue, clearly thinking about whether he should agree. Seeing that she had almost convinced Roy, the girl continued speaking, realizing that she simply had no right to let him go now. She offered her last argument, saying that she would not take a penny from the guy. And upon hearing this, the guy finally stopped and thought. Finally, the boy gave in and, sighing, turned to the girl, asking if she wanted him to simply join her academy. He was still interested in why Aura was offering so much for free, and she responded by saying that he would need to participate in the competition on behalf of the academy. She also said that he would have to tell everyone that he was studying with her. And the guy finally asked why him. In response, Aura said without a doubt that she saw great potential in him, and therefore would be glad to have his help. Having said everything she thought, the girl fell silent, waiting for the guy's final answer with severity, but strong desire in his gaze. Roy tilted his head to the side and smiled, thinking that the conditions were indeed pleasant. And besides, the girl was clearly not lying. Roy finally extended his hand for a handshake and introduced himself by name, agreeing with the girl's proposal. Taking a relaxed breath, the girl smiled happily and shook Roy's hand, and then introduced herself. The next morning, when Roy was already on the street, his phone suddenly rang, and the guy picked up the receiver and pressed the phone to his ear. The senior comrade on the other side of the call asked in surprise what he had done to get their boss fired. And Roy remembered how he had sarcastically asked Aura about it yesterday. He told his friend that his boss probably quit out of shame for what happened yesterday, and then changed the subject, telling him that he had finally gotten into the Hunter's Academy, which was where he had come. The first thing Aura did when she met the guy was give him his new hunting license, which will allow him to speed up his progress several times. And although the guy actually doubted that the girl would fulfill her promises, now he thanked her, a little surprised. Clutching his hunting license in his hand, the boy was happy that he had finally set foot on the path to fulfilling his dream, and asked how he could go on raids. And although Roy expected Aura to tell him everything, she suddenly turned away and said with a smile that there was no need for that, and then led the confused guy along with her. She brought him to the armory and gave him a choice of basic weapons that her students could use. She offered him a choice and said that after that they would go hunting together. And then she smiled slyly, making it clear that she would definitely help with everything. The girl also said that she had already signed a contract for him to travel to the dungeon that day, hoping that Roy would not mind. After just a couple of hours, Roy was boldly and without any particular difficulties moving through the dungeon, easily dealing with weak monsters. Once again waving his weapon, the guy asked why the girl had followed him at all if she had promised not to interfere. And Aura smiled slyly, confirming that she had not intended to. The girl noted that he was her student, which meant she couldn't leave him unattended, and told him to consider it personal training, causing Roy to smile. Seeing the smile, the girl noted that Roy was in the dungeon for the first time, and therefore he still needed her, and then added that he should be more careful. Throwing the spear onto his shoulder, the guy noticed, not without pleasure, that his blows were perfectly piercing the armor of the small monsters. The girl was quite surprised by this, because she thought that attacks not imbued with mana should simply bounce off their armor. But for some reason, Roy was able to attack them. At one point, his intuition made the guy duck from the unexpected attack of the kobold, and the girl screamed in panic, asking the guy to be careful. The monster managed to throw a frightened glance at the guy when he swung his spear, preparing to make a powerful attack on the monster. With a light movement, he attacked the monster, knocking it off its feet with one blow, and even wondering how his attack still managed to penetrate the kobold's armor. After defeating another monster, the guy looked at the phone screen and, not without a smile, noted that the progress of studying the lectures was slowly growing. And Aura was quite surprised by his behavior. Thinking that the guy would need to be covered while he looked at his phone, Aura placed her hand on the hilt of her blade. Roy smiled at her contentedly, because in this dungeon, by killing monsters, he became stronger, and he could also earn money, and therefore he suggested that she speed up. Smiling contentedly, the boy rushed forward through the cave, intending to confront several monsters at once for greater progress. The whole time they spent in the dungeon, the girl felt that he was somehow strange, because even after returning, he hardly looked away from his phone. Glancing at the screen at one point, the girl saw that the guy was staring at the blank screen non-stop and asked Roy about it, which surprised him greatly. Looking at the guy sitting on the floor and looking at the blank screen, zealously commenting on something, the girl thought that it was in vain that she invited a madman to her academy. But she couldn't help but admit that he was clearly handling the kobolds not like a novice, but like a real professional, although he had only just received his license. And in the end, he also asked her to help him drag the corpses of the killed monsters to the city so that he could sell them and get money, without stopping to do a squat in a step. And although Aura understood that she would soon need to introduce the student to her grandfather, she couldn't help but admit that his oddities were driving her crazy. Looking at his oddities, the girl sighed heavily and seriously wondered whether she had made the right choice. The next day after the trip to the dungeon, the guy smiled contentedly, looking at the account that had been replenished after selling the corpses of the kobolds. And although he had to drag and cut up the corpses himself, which greatly surprised Aura, the guy was pleased with the effort and the cost of such work. The only thing that upset him was the fact that he did not have time to listen to the lectures, because he spent so much time on these classes. The boy scratched his chin and wondered if he should call his older friend to help him with this matter. And although he could earn money from hunting and make progress in lectures, he still went rather slowly, which disappointed Roy a little. The boy remembered how strong the aura was that great sage Sun Wukong emitted, and wondered if he could become as strong as quickly as possible. Suddenly, the guy was surprised by his own thoughts, because he suddenly remembered that he had not listened to Sun Wukong's lectures at all, which was a big omission. He remembered that unlike other lectures, Sun Wukong's subject cost money, so Roy didn't even look at it. But now he has enough money for it. Roy was already thinking about paying, but with raised eyebrows in surprise, he realized that the lecture cost several dozen times more than he thought. Realizing how much it was, and that he wouldn't be able to earn that much even in a year, the guy sadly sank to the ground and sighed. Joylessly raising the phone to his face, Roy hopelessly noted that he wouldn't have time now anyway, which meant he would buy Sun Wukong's lectures some other time. Having closed the tab with dissatisfaction, the guy decided to study other items in the program to see if he could buy anything else there besides lectures. The guy was quite surprised when he realized that his guess was correct, because the program had a tab with equipment made by the Academy's students. The guy saw ads for the sale of items such as the Shield of Aegis or the Spear of Longinus from Myths, which were legendary items. Realizing that these items were clearly legendary, the guy was also surprised that for some reason they were called training items. Looking at this tab with curiosity, the boy realized that these items were also made by students, which meant those who had already become transcendents. Thinking that he would at least have enough money for a weapon, the guy began to scroll more actively, intending to buy something useful for himself. The next day, when Aura arrived at the academy, she found Roy already training. She noticed that for some reason he was moving even more actively than usual, and, noting this out loud, asked what had happened that he had become so energetic. It turned out that although Roy had expected the price for the replica Spear of Longinus to be incredibly high, he clearly didn't think it would cost a whole 100 million. And so he was furious. Roy realized that once again it all came down to money, and he sniffed sadly, wondering if he would ever be able to save up for Sun Wukong's lecture. Seeing that the guy looked very upset, the girl smiled encouragingly and asked him if he could spare her a minute. When he turned around, the girl told Roy that the academy tournament would be held very soon. And although the guy had heard about this before, he didn't know the details, and so he asked Aura to tell him more, which she did. Handing him a paper with the regulations and rules for the tournament, Aura also noted that the level of the academy was assessed at such a tournament. She said that their academy is currently at the lowest level, level 4. But if he shows success in the tournament, he will be able to raise their level and get more awards. Raising her index finger, she also mentioned that the state supports higher-level academies more readily, which means he will be able to earn more money. The guy was about to express a guess about why she was telling him this, but Aura interrupted him and, smiling slyly, confirmed his unspoken assumption. Smiling contentedly, she said that she wanted Roy to represent their academy in the upcoming tournament so that they could increase their level. The guy thought for a moment, wondering whether participating in the tournament would affect his progress in the lectures, and whether he would be able to become stronger in that case. Shrugging his shoulders, Roy decided that any fight would be excellent practice, so he should take part, and he smiled at the girl, agreeing. For some reason, his answer surprised Aura, but he noted that they had agreed on this from the beginning, and therefore asked to tell him how exactly the tournaments were held. Touching her chin and thinking, the girl noted that usually the details were kept secret until the very beginning of the exam. But usually you need to get a lot of points for raids and duels. Picking up his spear, Roy thought seriously about the fact that he had only fought monsters before, and only one of them was really strong, and therefore he had little experience. Crossing his arms over his chest and sighing a little sadly, the guy realized that he hadn't trained with people at all. And so, he thought about who could help him with this. He suddenly turned to Aura, who was standing behind him with a curious look, and seriously considered her candidacy for a sparring partner. He chuckled slyly and asked if the girl would chicken out. But Aura, displeased with the ridicule, frowned and picked up the training sword from the stand. Smiling contentedly at her reaction, the boy happily noted that this would be a great opportunity to gain experience, since Aura was an experienced hunter. As the girl, armed with a wooden sword, stood in front of Roy, ready to fight, the boy noted that he could feel an aura of strength coming from her. But in response to her fighting stance, the guy became embarrassed and blushed, thinking that he had long wanted to evaluate her strength, and the girl was even taken aback by his reaction. She asked if he really wanted her to fight him, since she was much more experienced than him. But Roy nodded affirmatively, not even doubting his decision. Smiling slyly and getting into a fighting stance, the guy jokingly asked his opponent for a handicap since she felt so sorry for him. Not taking the student's antics too seriously, the girl casually raised her sword and, sighing, suggested that Roy attack when he was ready. Surprisingly, he moved towards her quite quickly, intending to attack with a spear and saying that such an offer could not be refused. And although he moved briskly, Aura sighed a little upset, because she saw his every move, and his determination even upset her a little. With one smooth but strong movement, the girl intercepted the guy's attack and lashed out at the shaft of his spear, deflecting the attack to the side. Allowing the boy to get back into a fighting stance, the girl gave him the opportunity to attack. But his movements, although fast, were careless, and she easily dodged. Remembering how he moved in the dungeon, the girl was surprised that the guy was so careless in the fight with her, and therefore again doubted his potential. Sighing sadly during the training fight, she thought to herself that the guy was still an uncouth newbie. She didn't understand where the guy suddenly got the confidence that he could handle her, and so she wanted to show him the difference between them by crushing him with one powerful blow. And although the girl used a fairly strong attack and put a lot of her speed into it, she couldn't help but be surprised by what happened next. She watched in shock as her sword slammed into the shaft of Roy's spear, who used all of his reflexes to defend himself from the powerful attack. She looked at the boy's face to see how he felt about this action, but saw that he was all tense, trying to hold back her powerful attack. Realizing that she had unknowingly put her magic into the attack, the girl was even more surprised, asking herself how Roy had managed to reflect such a blow. She tried to understand this, but Roy did not let her be distracted for too long and swung his spear, intending to hit the girl in the face with the shaft, but she managed to defend herself. With a swing of her wooden blade, the girl pushed the guy's weapon away, and he slid to the side, trying to stay standing on both of his feet. Having managed to break the distance, the girl straightened up, trying to understand what was wrong with this guy if he, being an absolute newbie, managed to surprise her. Scratching his nose with his fist, the boy noted out loud with a smile that he was also going to fight her seriously since she was using such powerful attacks. Wiping the bruise on his lip, the guy rushed forward to attack, intending to continue the sparring that was so interesting to him. Aura noted, not without surprise, that his movements had become much clearer and more precise, and therefore she began to dodge and defend herself much more often. Re-intercepting his spear for another maneuver, the guy assessed the girl's defense, and she, looking into his eyes, saw cold calculation in them. In turn, Roy, fighting with the girl, heard the voice of one of his teachers, who helped him so much in battles. The boy heard Xiang Yu scolding him for his bad movements and recommending that he make more cunning attacks, and his attacks became much more precise. By swinging his spear, the boy began to feel both his opponent and the feeling of the battle itself much better. And all thanks to the hegemon king. Xiang Yu spoke irritably, as if right next to the boy's ear, irritably noting that any obvious attacks from Roy would be followed by obvious blocks. Roy listened to every hint from his ghostly mentor and fought persistently, forcing Aura to block his very strong blows. Xiang Yu insisted that Roy make lunge after lunge, forcing his opponent to defend until he could get a chance to attack in earnest. At one point, Aura lost her balance under the pressure of a particularly strong attack and began to fall on her back. And Roy, in turn, seized this moment and rushed forward. Seizing the moment, he swung his spear and was about to follow the hegemon king's advice and attack with all his might. For the first time during the entire battle, watching Roy's weapon approaching her, the girl seriously felt the real danger of her own life. And Roy, in turn, without holding back, struck, putting so much force into this attack that the stone floor began to split from the explosion of force. Aura suddenly woke up with a surprised expression on her face, standing on both feet and raising her sword to the side, not understanding what just happened. Looking ahead, Aura saw the boy slammed into the wall and realized that she hadn't noticed how she had blocked the attack and sent Roy flying. Aura realized that she had miscalculated her strength and had accidentally hit as hard as she could, and therefore could well have killed her student, and she rushed to the wounded man in panic. To the girl's surprise, Roy was not wounded and boldly rose to his feet, scratching the back of his head and noting that he had lost this fight after all. The girl's eyes widened in shock, realizing that the guy was seriously going to defeat her, and didn't allow himself to think about losing even for a second. In turn, Roy frowned and confirmed his guess that it would not work to fight against a person in the same way as against a monster, which surprised Aura even more. However, the guy did not despair and thought that, unlike many hunters, he still had everything ahead of him, and he would definitely become stronger. And in response to his thoughts, the phone vibrated. Looking at the screen, the guy happily noted that the progress of studying the lectures had increased, which meant that the fight against a person also gave the necessary experience, and Roy asked Aura if she would help him. The guy asked her to help him with sparring when they were distracted from raids, and his satisfied smile literally made the girl give a positive answer. And although Aura continued to be surprised that the guy wanted to continue fighting with her, even though he had just lost, she couldn't help but agree, since she had promised to train him. In addition, the girl promised the guy that she would give him all the prize money if he won the tournament, which surprised him greatly, because he had no idea about the prize. Frowning, the girl tried to remember how much they paid for winning the Academy tournament. It turned out that the prize money for the tournament more than covered the cost of the Spear of Longinus, which Roy so badly wanted to acquire. The girl noticed a sharp change in the guy's mood, who suddenly asked in a serious voice how soon the tournament would be over. She told him that the tournament would take place in 2 weeks, to which the guy enthusiastically exclaimed that he had to train tirelessly all this time. To the girl's bewilderment, the boy began training energetically, asking if he could pick up sandbags, and then asking if he could break off something heavier. Taking a huge and heavy piece of stone that they had broken off during the fight, the guy, motivated 100%, began training, and the girl was speechless. Once again, thinking that her student was crazy, Aura indifferently pointed to the sandbags in the corner of the training hall and asked him to use them. 2 weeks later, a young man wearing glasses and carrying a training bag on his back arrived at the venue of the Academy tournament. Noticing that a really large crowd of spectators had come to the tournament, the guy looked around, trying to figure out where to go. Looking around the crowds of people, the guy was talking about how many people had become awakened recently, giving the impression of being a big, conceited person. Remembering that he needed to hurry, the guy moved towards the man who was a worker and, introducing himself as a participant, asked where he should go. He finally got to the waiting room, where he saw a bunch of awakened from different academies, and the guy's confidence began to slowly melt away. Seeing the very strong young men who were to become his rivals, the guy became so excited that he couldn't even move. Looking over the participants, he noticed that they had very good equipment, and, judging by everything, they were all clearly confident in themselves. And although the guy wasn't surprised that he saw a bunch of people who looked much stronger than him, his attention was suddenly drawn to a seemingly nondescript guy sitting on a bench and looking at his phone. Looking closely at his potential opponent, the boy was surprised to see that the young man was holding an old-looking spear, and his muscles were not visible at all. Adjusting his glasses, the guy concluded that this unknown person had clearly come from some backwater, trying to let everyone know about his village academy. In turn, Roy, who was the one in question, joylessly noting that he could hear everything, shook his head and muttered under his breath that it would be better to continue listening to the lectures. The people around were sneering, looking at the spearman and thinking that he would definitely be one of the first to lose. And the guy with glasses frowned, feeling that something was wrong. Thinking that Roy was as shy as the boy himself, he assumed that they would definitely become friends, which could not but please him. And although Roy didn't understand why the bespectacled boy was looking at him with such enthusiasm, the boy clearly thought that Roy was looking at his phone only so that he wouldn't be pestered. Eventually, the boy approached Roy and, slightly hesitantly, said hello, distracting the spearman from listening to the lectures. Scratching the top of his head, the bespectacled man introduced himself as Fred and tried to somehow start a conversation with his new acquaintance. Roy shrugged without much enthusiasm and introduced himself, although he didn't understand why anyone would talk to him at all. Fred asked to sit next to him, to which Roy also half-heartedly agreed, although he thought to himself that the boy looked younger than the usual participant. Noticing a conflict brewing on the other side of the break room, Fred pointed his finger there and introduced Roy to a certain Mike, who was a student at one of the most famous academies. Pointing to his weapon, Fred noted that Mike used an axe and almost always relied on strength alone, forgetting about tricks. Pointing towards the person Mike was arguing with, Fred introduced Roy to Harold, a student at a rival academy to Mike's. Fred said that Harold seemed like a very unusual opponent to everyone, as he fought with 2 daggers, which was a rare choice for hunters. Fred surprised Roy quite a bit, and Mike, in turn, was ready to grab the axe. But a voice from the side interrupted him. Everyone was quite surprised to see a rather stocky guy in an expensive suit and with bright red hair, confidently looking at everyone who was his potential opponent. Looking sternly at the disputants, the guy noted that they were not alone here, and therefore they should not argue so loudly, disturbing people from getting ready. Roy glanced with only a little interest at the guy who had so easily silenced the disputants, and then glanced at Fred. Surprisingly, Fred knew him too, introducing the guy to Roy as Joshua, who was one of the most famous students of the academies and most likely the winner of the tournament. Seeing even the strong Mike trembling with excitement, Roy asked again why Fred considered him the winner, to which he noted that he was simply the strongest. To point out how much stronger Joshua was than the other students, Fred noted that he was even invited to the academy by the great swordsman's granddaughter, whom Roy recognized as Aura. Fred noted that he didn't know why, but Joshua refused the offer. But he clearly had some reason for it. Apparently not heeding his own request to be quiet, Joshua suddenly punched the trash can, slamming it against the wall and furiously asking why he had to fight such weaklings. He muttered under his breath that it was all his uncle's fault, and it was only because of him that they still hadn't advanced to the 3rd level of the academy. Roaring with rage, Joshua noted that he saw no point in fighting weaklings, since he would not become stronger at all, and therefore he already regretted turning down Aura Bauer's offer. Remembering that time when she offered him to enroll, the guy didn't want to, because her academy was completely unknown to anyone. But now he understood that he could simply use her. Suddenly, something unusual caught his attention, and, distracted from his gloomy thoughts, the guy turned to the side. He saw that some strange, rather frail guy, armed with some old spear, was looking at him with a rather stern look. He thought Roy was some kind of plebeian, and therefore decided that the academies were in really bad shape, since even such mediocrities were given the opportunity to participate. And although Joshua gave Roy a hard look, the guy was only thinking about how much money he could get for a fight with him, when suddenly an announcement was heard about the imminent start of the tournament. Fred excitedly noted that it was probably about to start, and Roy silently stood up from his seat, getting ready for the heavy workload that was about to begin. Remembering that he had been increasing his progress for 2 whole weeks during the lectures of Chiron and the Hegemon King, the guy twirled the spear in his hand and moved towards the entrance to the tournament territory. Looking at his hand, Roy thought that he didn't feel much of a change. And besides, he lacked experience compared to the others. However, clenching his fist, he decided that he would not let his insecurities stop him and prevent him from winning, because he was going to win it at any cost. Smiling proudly, the guy decided that it didn't matter to him whether the person in front of him was a monster or a human. He would defeat anyone, and would definitely buy himself the Spear of Longinus. And although Roy was ready for battle, he suddenly found himself in the middle of strange forks, hearing from the speakers an announcement about the start of the race in the maze. Meanwhile, whole crowds of people sat in the stands and looked at the screen, joyfully shouting in anticipation of the spectacle. A skinny guy with a camera called one of the spectators over to him, shouting that he had taken his friend's place. Walking towards a friend, the man unexpectedly bumped into an unfamiliar girl with his shoulder and accidentally pushed her. Replacing his shout at his friend with an apologetic tone, the man asked the girl, who was covering herself with her cap, for forgiveness. Sitting down in his place, he looked at the stranger with curiosity and noticed that she seemed familiar to him, but he could not remember who it was. His friend began to tell about how the tournament had just begun, and the participants found themselves in a labyrinth from which they had to get out without attacking other participants. Looking at the huge screen, they could see Mike raising his huge axe and rushing at a minotaur-like monster, and they concluded that the participants were getting hints for killing monsters. Harold, apparently, had already defeated his first monster, and was now studying the clue he had received on how to move towards the exit. The audience concluded that this exam was testing how people could navigate a raid, and the man concluded that the students this year were quite gifted. And on the screen at this time, causing a storm of applause with his actions, Joshua swung his blade, killing several monsters at once. His gaze was full of confidence and cruelty directed at the monsters, and the guy exhaled, getting ready to continue moving through the labyrinth. His actions were so precise and polished that men watched his every move in amazement, already thinking that he was a real genius. In turn, the girl, who turned out to be Aura and covered herself with a cap so as not to be recognized, noted to herself that Joshua had become even stronger and would most likely win. Sighing desperately, the girl asked herself in frustration what Joshua was doing at the tournament, since he always considered them a waste of time. Realizing that she was attracting attention with her indignation, the girl turned away from the man, who looked at her doubtfully, trying to remember who she was. Meanwhile, Roy was hitting the wall with his spear, trying to see if he could break through it. But unfortunately, nothing came of it. Roy frowned and thought that he would have to go through the same thing as everyone else, and it would have been better if he had signed up for Theseus's lectures. Putting his hand to the wall, the guy decided that he would walk along it so as not to get lost, and thus try to find a way out of the trap. Suddenly, something ahead caught his attention, and the guy looked around the corner to see what was so interesting. There was a fork in the road in front of him, and it offered him 4 different directions to go. However, Roy decided not to guess, and therefore preferred to follow his rule and follow only one wall, and thus reach the end. Sighing from the realization that he might have to move for a very long time, the guy turned left and walked along the wall, not letting go of his hands. However, suddenly an unusual feeling filled his mind, and Roy thought that his decision was wrong. Turning, he looked at the other passage and felt that for some reason this was where he needed to go. Thinking that this was the 6th sense Chiron was talking about, Roy began to doubt himself, but decided that he had to trust himself and moved forward. He was afraid that following a proven method would be much more logical, but he could not force himself to go against his own feelings. Scratching the back of his head, he decided to move on, trying to listen to his own intuition. Walking further, Roy felt another strange sensation, which for some reason made him feel uncomfortable. He suddenly heard that one of the participants had dropped out of the competition, and this information seemed very curious to the guy. Frowning, the boy thought about how the other participants were constantly fighting monsters, but for some reason he himself had not yet met a single one. Suddenly it dawned on him that his intuition was not just telling him how to get to the exit, but was also helping him avoid monsters. He thought that if he could sense situations like this with a 30% chance, then with a 100% chance he could possibly see the future. However, the joy of anticipation of the power he could wield was marred when Roy heard Fred's voice behind him, asking him to be quiet. Looking around in confusion, Fred noticed that Roy was walking so confidently, as if he knew where to go and where the exit was. Roy said that he was just going at random, to which Fred indignantly exclaimed that this was not right, and he knew how to move correctly through the mazes, and therefore now he would lead. Fred smugly placed his hand on the wall and pointed out that they should always move along one wall, to which Roy noted with displeasure that it was too long. Fred gloomily and upsetly noted that, walking at random, it was easy to get lost, to which Roy indifferently suggested that they split up. He asked why Fred had even tagged along with the spearman, to which the bespectacled man enthusiastically exclaimed that he considered Roy his brother in misfortune. Roy asked again, not understanding, and Fred noted that he had not come from the academy, but on his own, and therefore decided that his new friend was the same. Roy finally understood why Fred had approached him in the first place, and then heard the boys say that weaklings were better off sticking together, which greatly surprised the spearman. The guy scratched his head in shock and thought about how it could have happened that he looked like a weakling in the eyes of others. Fred suddenly distracted Roy and said that since he was also alone, he would make an exception and show him something very cute. And taking out his phone, he showed a photo of his sister, which scared Roy a little. Having said that his little sister was really very sweet, the guy turned around abruptly and walked away, saying that he regretted this meeting. But Fred did not leave him alone. Roy tried to get rid of the guy, but Fred kept whining about how they should stick together, and it would be easier for them to get through the maze. Roy finally sighed, and Fred timidly noted that it really was much safer together, which aroused Roy's pity. Roy sighed and pointed out that Fred kept talking about being all alone, then asked if his family had come to support him. Quite calmly, although a little sadly, the guy noted that his parents had died, and he had no one except his sister, which greatly surprised Roy. He remembered how he himself was left completely alone, and how hard it was for him to survive in this cruel world alone. Frowning, the boy gripped the shaft of his spear and sighed heavily, beginning to think again. Fred thought that he had put his new friend in an awkward position, and so he tried to make excuses and point out that his little sister was too young for such events. Finally, Roy sighed again and said that Fred was right, and that they really were brothers in misfortune. Smiling at his comrade, the boy grabbed the spear more comfortably and, without saying anything now, moved away, leaving Fred the choice of whether to follow him or not. And although Roy offered the guy partnership, he did not forget to note that they were still rivals, which meant that he would single-handedly take the prize of 100,000. Not understanding why Roy had suddenly changed his mind so abruptly, Fred froze in place and then smiled, happy with his new friend's words. But although he agreed to go along, he could not understand not only where the guy was going, but also why he was doing it at a run, causing Fred to become very short of breath. Roy pointed out the fact that Fred had chosen to follow him, so he shouldn't complain about having to try. Trying to understand how his comrade was thinking, Fred thought about the fact that Roy, apparently, did not think at all about where he was going. And yet, they still had not met a single monster. He even allowed himself to assume that Roy knew where he was going, although this seemed impossible to the guy. Suddenly, Roy's intuition seemed to fail, and he found himself at a dead end, while Fred was finally able to stop and catch his breath. However, despite Fred's questions, Roy refused to believe that his intuition had failed him, and so he looked at the wall in front of him and touched it with his hand, sensing a catch. To Fred's surprise, who actually thought the wall was a dead end, Roy pushed the door forward with one simple movement, not understanding how the wall could deceive anyone at all. In turn, Fred stared in front of him in amazement, trying to understand how smart Roy was if he could figure out the secret of this door so easily. Welcome, music and confetti began to fly around, and congratulations on winning the challenge, and the information that Roy had broken the record came from the speakers. The people around him weren't paying any attention to Roy, so it was an incredible shock to them that someone had already managed to get out of the maze, and the winner wasn't Joshua. Even Aura, who had been watching Joshua's battles the entire time, couldn't help but tremble in her voice in surprise at the fact that Roy turned out to be the winner. Even Fred, who came out of the maze second, was stunned by the realization that Roy had managed to win. Roy, in turn, cleaned his ear with his finger in displeasure, muttering under his breath that he was unhappy with the fact that he had made absolutely no progress in his training. The two friends had already returned to the restroom, but Fred still couldn't believe that he had gotten out of the maze second. The other participants, who had previously mocked Roy, now tried to find out more about him and understand how he had coped. While Roy took out his phone, wanting to at least listen to the lectures during the break, Joshua, who had been selected third, suddenly approached him. The guy put his hands in his pockets and looked with hatred at Roy, who suddenly noticed his rival's unpleasantly close attention. Roy tried to figure out why Joshua had even approached him while everyone in the waiting room fell silent, waiting to see what would happen next. Roy looked at the guy kindly and with obvious curiosity, waiting to hear what exactly the talented awakened one wanted to tell him. However, Joshua remained silent, frowning at Roy and trying to gauge his strength. Suddenly, he turned away and walked away, grinning and saying out loud that Roy seemed even too weak to him. Seeing the reaction of the most popular student, the other participants also looked at Roy with disapproval, thinking that he was probably just lucky. Shrugging his shoulders and trying not to listen to other people's ridicule, Roy turned the phone back on and decided to continue listening to the lectures when a worker suddenly entered the room. Roy raised his head and the man began to speak, announcing what would await the participants in the next stage. Roy heard that in the next stage, the participants would fight one-on-one, but they would be prohibited from enhancing their attacks with mana. The man noted that the judges would monitor the progress of the fight and stop it if one of the participants was unable to fight, and then added that there would be 16 fights. Roy scratched his nose and tried to guess who he would be sparring with, but suddenly his attention was drawn to one of the participants wanting to ask a question. Much to Roy's surprise, the guy said that he was going to withdraw from the tournament and did not want to participate in the next stage. At the same time, Aura, after Roy's victory, left the stands for spectators, escaping from unexpected attention. Taking a breath, she muttered under her breath that she had come very close to having her identity exposed. The very man she had just happened to bump into was about to make a guess about who she was when she shouted out Roy's name. Covering herself with a cap and deciding to take a little rest, the girl noted that she would never have thought that Roy could win at all. Suddenly, her attention was drawn to the events taking place near the information desk, where people were indignant that the number of participants was clearly less than originally announced. It turned out that some participants withdrew from the task, and now those who wanted to place bets will have no interest in doing what they had planned. The man behind the counter chuckled and said there was no point in betting in the first place because Joshua would definitely win. The worker was about to say that no one would dare bet against Joshua, but suddenly a suitcase fell in front of him, and someone's voice announced a bet of hundreds of millions on Roy. The people around looked in surprise at the one who dared to make such a strange and desperate bet. But the man was wrapped in a cloak. The men began to complain that the guy had just been lucky in the first test, and now he would definitely lose because he came from an unknown academy, and Aura was watching everything from around the corner. The stranger in the cloak radiated an aura of unconditional confidence, although his face was not even visible. At the same time, Roy, throwing his spear over his shoulder and sadly noting that many people had refused to participate, said with disappointment that now the tournament would be much more boring. He tried to analyze how it happened that so many participants were simply afraid to continue participating in the tournament. When he heard one of the participants want to leave, he couldn't understand the meaning. But Fred told his friend that this was not uncommon at level 4 tournaments. It turned out that the students were simply afraid of Joshua, believing that he could ignore the rules and simply cripple his opponent, depriving him of a future among the hunters. Even besides Joshua, there are worthy rivals. For example, Mike and Harold, who took 4th and 5th places in the first stage. Realizing that the chances were slim and that the attempt could be dangerous to health, the participants preferred to give up rather than deprive themselves of their future. The fear was so contagious that the participants gave up one after another, wanting to leave the tournament venue as quickly as possible. Roy couldn't understand how it was possible to give in to fear so easily and allow oneself to surrender. But Fred believed that together with Roy, they would definitely cope. Thus, after the elimination of the underpants, among the active participants, there remained only 5 participants who took the highest places in the first stage. A couple of minutes later, the participants were informed of the order in which they would fight, and Roy was to fight Mike. Joshua was supposed to fight Fred, while Harold, unfortunately or fortunately, did not get an opponent. Roy, who was absolutely calm and had thrown his spear over his shoulder, noticed with surprise that Fred was shaking all over with fear. Roy asked his friend what was wrong, to which Fred simply exploded with emotion and began to cry, exclaiming that he was insanely afraid, and asking if Roy himself was really not afraid at all. The guy shook his friend, exclaiming that he would have to fight Joshua one-on-one later, and that made him even more scared. Smiling kindly, the guy asked with a smile how Fred had managed to determine the winner of the fight before it even started, and patted his friend on the shoulder in a friendly manner. And when Fred said that he was absolutely sure, Roy suddenly became serious and asked directly why he didn't just withdraw from the tournament. Fred placed his hands on his knees and looked down, muttering guiltily that he couldn't do it. But he didn't have time to explain because Roy and Mike were called out. After squeezing the spear in his hand a couple of times, the guy stood up and said that Fred should fight with all his strength, since he was going to fight anyway, because he could win. As he moved towards the exit, Fred suddenly grabbed his friend's hand, causing him to look confused. Turning to his comrade, Roy looked at him in surprise, asking a silent question, and Fred, stumbling, tried to find what to say. Finally, he asked in a trembling voice if Roy was worried, because he really couldn't understand how this was possible. Roy grinned proudly and said that he wasn't afraid at all and was only concerned about how much he would get for winning this tournament, and how much experience he would get for the fight. Freeing his hand from the grip of a surprised Fred, Roy moved towards the exit, thinking only about how nice it would be to receive a whole 100,000. As he entered the arena, the boy heard the host introduce him, intriguing the audience and mentioning that Roy had broken the record for completing the maze. Smiling at the spectators who were shouting his name, the guy looked at his opponent, who was also about to be introduced. Mike laughed sarcastically, noting that luck wouldn't help the guy at all this time, and he would deal with him without any particular problems. To Roy's bewilderment, Mike continued to laugh, pointing out that the guy's luck had run out, since right after the first stage he had been matched with the most inconvenient opponent. However, Roy interrupted the big guy and said quite calmly that they still had to find out who was really unlucky in this battle. And when the fight was declared to have begun, Mike, without holding back, rushed forward with his huge axe in his hands, apparently intending to chop up his opponent. Seeing his opponent so easily succumb to his emotions, Roy smiled contentedly, ready to meet Mike's attack. And while the battle was going on, in the restroom, Fred thought for a long time about the words of his friend, who went into battle without fear. Sighing and looking up, the boy wanted to see how his comrade was fighting, worrying about his safety. However, he immediately looked away from the screen and shook his head, deciding that now was not the time to worry about others, and that he needed to concentrate on himself. Turning his head, Fred looked at Joshua, who was standing near the wall and gloomily thinking about something. Fred thought back to Roy's encouraging words, wondering if he should really fight as hard as he could and what his chances of winning were. But fear was making it hard to think straight. Breathing heavily, the boy tried to hold back the trembling that had taken over his body, but it was incredibly difficult to do so. Fred desperately thought that Mike, Harold, and Joshua all represented very famous and powerful academies, and he was definitely not their equal. But then his attention was drawn to what was happening on the screen. Looking up to where Joshua and Harold were looking, Fred saw something that surprised not only him, but, according to the host, all the viewers. The fight was over almost instantly, and Roy was now standing over the defeated Mike, lying on the floor, looking down at him. Joshua responded to the situation by saying out loud that scum belonged with scum, clearly implying that Mike should not have lost. Suddenly, the red-haired man noticed Fred standing up and, without taking his eyes off the screen, coping with the trembling in his body. The guy's gaze was clear, and, although he was clearly afraid, Fred finally found the strength to deal with him. And so he spoke, promising that he too would not lose to his opponent. And his words were so offensive to Joshua that he was ready to growl in response. But he held back, allowing himself to only clench his fists tighter. A few minutes ago, Mike rushed at his opponent in a mad rage, wanting to tear him to pieces. However, Roy, with calmness in his eyes and mind, took a step back without any problems, dodging the berserker's attack. The presenter commented on each action and noted, not without surprise, that luck was apparently still on Roy's side, since he was able to dodge so easily. Mike continued to chop with his axe, wanting to deal with the enemy as quickly as possible. But Roy, as if not taking the enemy seriously, easily defended himself. With each attack, Mike became more and more angry, because he did not understand how some weakling could so easily dodge his powerful blows. Entering into the battle spirit and completely forgetting about the rules, Mike decided to use his most powerful attack and put mana into it to sweep the enemy out of the arena. However, Roy, with one deft and swift movement, swung his spear, knocking the axe out of his opponent's hands and not allowing him to strike. Mike even lost touch with reality for a couple of seconds, and only then realized that his favorite weapon had flown out of his hands. Shocked by what had happened, Mike staggered back in shock, losing his understanding of how such a thing could have happened. The eyes of the one who had relied on his own strength all this time were now filled with fear from the realization that for the first time in his entire life, he had lost to someone. Roy twisted the spear in his hand and relaxed his muscles, looking down at his fallen opponent as if there had been no fight between them at all. After the fight, the guy looked at his phone screen and was very disappointed to see that his progress had changed only slightly. Running out of the arena, the guy noted with disappointment that he had hoped to get much more progress and experience for winning against a human. The guy suddenly realized that he was also being pushed by the limited time, because of which he might not have time to complete not only the Buddha course, but even Chiron and Xiangyu. Sadly wondering what to do, the guy decided that he needed to be more economical and extend his pass after buying the spear. As soon as the guy entered the waiting room, he was immediately met by Fred, who energetically greeted his comrade with congratulations on his victory. Immediately after Roy, a worker entered the room, inviting the participants of the second fight to enter the arena. Fred became agitated again, and Joshua stood up from his seat, frowning at the waste of his time. As he walked towards the exit, the boy nudged Fred with his shoulder, ordering a plebeian like him not to dare stand in his way. Roy watched Joshua leave with a disgruntled look, and Fred spoke up, asking his friend to remember that in the maze he had said that it was better for them to stick together. He said that he himself did not know why, but when they met, he saw a kindred spirit in Roy, and it was for this reason that he decided to stick together with him. And when Roy beat Mike, Fred, although he was happy for his friend, envied him, because the guy had absolutely no talent, and he was sure that he would be unlucky. But he raised his fist, clenched it, and said much more firmly that he only wanted his little sister to be proud of her brother. Fred was called back, and he jumped up to go into the arena. And Roy wished him luck and asked him to give it his all. Hearing that the guy promised to definitely try, Roy smiled and promised that they would definitely meet together in the final. Entering the arena, Fred looked around in amazement, hearing cries of support from both his side and his opponent, while Joshua chuckled in displeasure. Raising his hand to his chest, the guy breathed deeply, telling himself that he would definitely cope and be able to win this fight. Hearing his opponent's muttering, Joshua barked at him to shut up, pointing out that the guy was incredibly annoying to him. Taking out his sword, the guy looked around sullenly and said out loud that everything irritated him in general, and he considered it a real humiliation to participate in this tournament. He also exclaimed that Fred was nothing more than trash in his eyes, and he was shocked that he had to fight him. Silently looking up at his opponent, Fred saw the angry, furious look of someone who was not going to fight, but to kill. And the guy's confidence began to melt. Fred sensed real danger from Joshua, and so he gripped his blade still in its sheath tighter. The boy looked away, and Joshua, considering this a big mistake, confidently said that Fred was the perfect prey. He imagined the guy as a lamb whose life exists only so that he, being a predator, could eat him. Joshua was full of confidence that his predatory nature would win this fight without a single chance of failure. Throwing aside all other emotions, the boy concentrated on his bloodlust, intending to show his opponent that he was only lucky to get here. And now it was time for him to fall back. He silently thought about how he had to win both stages, because he was head and shoulders above everyone who came to this tournament. But, being sure that his opponent would definitely lose, the boy was surprised when he saw Fred take out his blade and calm his trembling, preparing to resist. Joshua was shocked to realize that the pathetic lamb was about to bite back, not allowing himself to be killed so easily. This gesture offended the guy so much that Joshua allowed himself to rush the judge, asking when the fight would start, to which he received the answer that they would be announced very soon. And so, they began to announce them, and Fred, looking firmly at his opponent, thought that he would definitely try as hard as his friend Roy. In turn, Joshua looked at his opponent with disdain, wanting to deal with him as quickly as possible, and thinking that there was no point in the tournament at all. As soon as the host finally announced the start of the fight, Joshua tried to finish it with one single punch. But Fred managed to react and block the attack. In response, Joshua attacked his opponent again, forcing him to defend himself from blows of incredible force. He struck his blade again and again, trying to break through the enemy's pathetic and flimsy defense, while Fred desperately defended himself, blocking every powerful blow from his opponent. After another attack, Joshua called Fred a pathetic brat and grabbed the blade more comfortably, preparing to perform a dirty trick. With a light movement of his hand, the boy struck his opponent in the stomach with the hilt of his sword, knocking the wind out of the boy. The blow was so powerful that Fred's glasses flew off his eyes and blood gushed from his mouth. Having fallen to his knee, the guy tried to come to his senses, while the spectators watching the fight thought that this was the end of the fight. Holding his body with his hand, the guy thought that Joshua was even too strong, and it would be unlikely to defeat him. The boy pressed his blade into the ground and tried to stay on his feet, but fell to both knees, with despair in his eyes, realizing that he was no match for his opponent. Kneeling down and trying to catch his breath, the boy thought with panic in his mind about how much he wanted his sister to be proud of him. Tears came to his eyes as he realized how naive he had been to think he could be as strong as his friend Roy. As Joshua moved closer to see the despair in his opponent's eyes, Fred suddenly stood up on both feet and, trembling, grabbed the blade. Glaring at Joshua, Fred convinced himself to keep fighting, to hit his opponent at least once, no matter how strong he was. Rushing forward, the boy swung his blade, intending to hit his opponent with one desperate attack. The tip of the sword was already approaching Joshua's face, but there was no fear, no excitement, no sense of danger in his eyes. The entire arena suddenly heard the sound of a loud blow, causing all the spectators to hold their breath, trying to see who had won the fight. However, the result was predictable, and the winner was Joshua, who stood over Fred, who had fallen to the ground and dropped his sword. The audience chattered among themselves, claiming that they were not at all surprised by the fact that Joshua had won. And although everyone around him was saying that Joshua was too strong and that he clearly belonged in tournaments of a much higher level, he himself suddenly noticed that a drop of blood was running down his cheek. The boy was stunned to feel a scratch on his face and realized that his opponent had managed to get him, even if only once. The worst part for Joshua was Fred's stammering wheeze as he asked if he had managed to hit his opponent. The guy looked at the defeated man with a look full of arrogance, in which there was not even a drop of pity or respect. Joshua's mind, certain that no one had even the right to touch him, began to be clouded by a raging rage, encouraged by the exclamations surrounding him. He heard people calling him a bastard who didn't even bat an eyelid at his victory over a weak opponent, and he himself tried to understand how some scum could hurt him. To everyone's surprise, Joshua muttered to the judge checking on Fred that he was going to withdraw from the tournament, leaving him puzzled. As the referee attempted to lift Fred up, Joshua stepped towards them and swung his knee at the boy's face, causing him to fall to the ground again. Filled with rage, Joshua began to shout, calling everyone around him real, talentless plebeians, unworthy of even standing in his shadow. The referee tried to warn the guy that he should stop, but he, drunk with anger, took another step towards his defeated opponent. Once again calling everyone around him worthless, Joshua allowed himself the most disrespectful act by stepping on Fred's head as he lay on the ground. The guy lowered his voice and put a sword to the guy's neck, saying that no one had the right to wound him and stay alive. But before he could do what he wanted, Roy appeared in front of him, forcing the guy to defend himself with a powerful attack. The guy noted that he was really looking forward to them meeting in the final, but he was already tired of waiting, and Joshua's antics got on his nerves. Roy swung his spear, glaring at Joshua and promising to beat him up right now since he was so desperate to get it. But the first thing Roy did when their weapons clashed was demand that Joshua remove his foot first. And although Joshua didn't understand what exactly his opponent meant, Roy repeated himself, telling the guy to take his foot off his friend's head. Hearing the guy's words, Joshua only smirked and pressed his foot even more firmly onto Fred's head, causing Roy to frown. Roy gave his opponent a disdainful look as he heard Joshua ask what his opponent would do to him if the boy refused to obey. Roy ripped out his spear and swung it right in front of Joshua's face, forcing him to dodge and eventually remove his leg. And as soon as the guy landed and prepared for a new fight, he immediately relaxed his body in surprise, seeing Roy kneeling next to his friend, asking about his condition. The guy allowed himself a sarcastic comment, but Roy didn't pay any attention to it, trying to bring his friend to his senses. Fred, having cleared his throat, came to his senses, although it was clear from his appearance that he had not yet recovered from his injuries. And Roy, enraged by Joshua's actions, threw him an angry look. He began to curse the guy angrily, asking how he dared to act so disgustingly, stepping on the head of another, including his rival. However, Joshua, without even a grain of regret, haughtily noted that Roy really didn't understand him, and then explained that pathetic rednecks had no right to stand in his way. Hugging his friend and not letting him lie on the hard ground, the guy angrily asked if they really had no right to dream if they weren't that famous. Joshua even chuckled, asking how Roy could be so naive, and then asked if he was going to start talking about how they could make it if they tried. People around tried to understand why the judges were not stopping what was happening, but it turned out that they had received orders not to interfere. In turn, Aura, being on the stands and watching what was happening in the arena, was already completely worried about her student. Meanwhile, Joshua, completely out of his mind with rage and disdain, tried to explain to Roy that his paltry skills were nothing compared to his talent. He insisted that this cruel world would never accept anyone so naive, and in order to succeed in this life, one must step over heads. He screamed at his opponent, still holding his friend in his arms, not understanding how he could be so stupid and not understand the most simple truths. Roy thought sadly that he had previously thought exactly the same as his opponent, because his life had been incredibly difficult and full of adversity. He also remembered feeling disgusted and hating himself when he realized that he had no money, no talent, no future. Roy, with a heavy heart, thought during long days filled with work about how his life would have turned out if he had stopped clinging to his dream. Finally, he asked one of the judges to take care of his wounded comrade, and he himself stood up, gripping his spear tighter and glaring at his opponent. Straightening up, the guy sighed and noted that he still did not agree with his rival, because this kind of thinking leads people to despair. To the surprise of all the spectators, Roy suddenly calmed his nerves and cast a glance at Joshua, full not of hatred, but of determination to prove his opponent wrong. And, to the surprise of everyone, including the judges, Roy rushed at Joshua, twirling the spear in his hands and intending to prove his point with action. Using his spear skillfully, the boy spun it with one hand so fast that the shaft vibrated in the air, preparing to attack his opponent, although the judges tried to stop him. In turn, Joshua only sighed in disappointment, not at all worried that he was about to be attacked with a deadly weapon right now. And then he grinned in a way that resembled a devil whose evil plan had been accomplished. And with his evil gaze, he expressed the thought that this scum still had not understood him. And although Roy put a lot of strength into his attack, it didn't take much effort for Joshua to raise his sword and easily block the blow. For a second, their gazes clashed, as did their weapons, expressing the clash between Joshua's contemptuous vision and Roy's steadfast thinking. The villain swung his blade and pushed his opponent back with such force that Roy had to make an effort to maintain his balance. Not wanting to let his opponent be convinced of his rightness, Joshua rushed forward with great speed, planning to destroy the enemy with a powerful blow of his sword. He moved incredibly fast and showered the guy with a whole hail of powerful attacks, but Roy blocked them all, although it was difficult for him. Several attacks even passed through the guy's defense, although they left only small scratches. But Roy understood that his opponent was terribly strong. He thought that fighting against Mike was easy, and the guy had no doubts about his victory. But now he began to worry about his strength. But just as worry filled his mind, Roy stopped his thinking, forcing himself to calm down and stop worrying. Sighing and closing his eyes, the boy allowed his own feelings to take over his body, and after a couple of seconds, he was finally able to feint and reach the enemy and strike with the shaft of the spear. And although Joshua did not allow himself to fall from the blow and then push the enemy away from himself with a blow of the blade, his face expressed bewilderment. The judges finally tried to stop the fighters, but Joshua screamed in rage, demanding that the people interfering with him shut up and not interfere with their fight. And although the guy was confident in his victory and, as usual, felt like a predator, Roy's gaze, which had fallen into a fighting frenzy, made the guy doubt. Looking into the guy's eyes, Joshua noticed that Roy now looked like a real predator, which couldn't help but surprise him. And although the guy couldn't understand how some pathetic scum allowed himself to radiate an aura of danger, he grinned maliciously, claiming that there was no harm in dreaming. With one sharp movement, Joshua found himself an elbow away from his opponent, and sarcastically noted that his dreams would all be destroyed when the guy faced reality. And at the same moment, trying not to give the enemy time to react, Joshua swung his blade and struck. Although Roy blocked this blow as well, Joshua couldn't understand how some pathetic piece of trash managed to block his attacks time after time. And Roy, tensing his whole body, tried to keep up with his opponent's pace. The villain attacked again, but this blow was also blocked, and Roy suddenly twisted his spear so that Joshua did not have time to react. Suddenly, he interrupted the guy's series of attacks that had just begun and attacked with a spear, forcing the enemy to hesitate and take a step back, thinking about the course of the battle. To his own surprise, looking into his opponent's eyes, Joshua began to realize that with each block, Roy seemed to be getting stronger. He attacked again and again, but before he could concentrate his pressure, he found himself forced to defend himself again. Suddenly, both of the boys' blows were so powerful that, unwilling to cancel their attacks, they both fell under each other's attacks. They both hit the opponent's torso so well that each had to lunge back to gain some distance and assess the progress of the fight. Joshua's mind was in confusion, as he sincerely could not understand how some redneck could not only defend himself, but also attack successfully. Refusing to accept the fact that someone could be as strong as him, Joshua raised his sword again in anger. His blade flared with a magical aura, indicating that the guy decided to put mana into his attacks, and Roy was seriously worried because he still didn't know how to fight with this style. His gaze became truly insane, and the people around him woke up, and the guards rushed to the arena, intending to stop the guy, because it became obvious that he was going to kill his enemy. Knowing that he had no chance against the magical attack, Roy knew he had to run, but he couldn't bring himself to do it, and suddenly heard Xiang Yu's voice. As if standing right behind the boy, the hegemon king told him how he had once been surrounded by an entire army of the Chu kingdom, and that time, he had almost without thinking, rushed into an unequal battle. He said that much later, one of the students asked the master why he did this, since only defeat awaited him, and the warrior did not argue with this. As Joshua rushed towards his opponent in a reckless attack, Xiang Yu revealed the secret that on that day, for the first time, he felt despair and fear of his own defeat. And although he experienced emotions that make people give up, he still rushed into battle, and all for one simple reason. He revealed his biggest secret to the guy, saying that true strength lies not in physical abilities, but in the unconditional will to move towards victory, even knowing that defeat is inevitable. He said that this was what made him the hegemon king. And now Roy must make faith in victory his strength, and the boy, hearing this, desperately rushed forward, knowing that he could die. And although Joshua was still about to kill his enemy, his opponent's confidence offended him so much that he again cried out about his superiority. He swung his blade and only now noticed that Roy's spear also glowed with a magical aura. But this did not frighten the self-confident swordsman at all. Screaming in rage about wanting to see the boy die as soon as possible, Joshua swung his blade, expecting it to cut through the pliable flesh without much difficulty. In turn, Roy, without wasting time on speeches, cried out from the emotions that overwhelmed him and faith in his own strength. And at the same moment, their weapons clashed, and the collapse from their contact was so great that the hard stone surface of the arena began to tear apart, and the magic contained in each of the boys' weapons merged into one, causing a flash of light that briefly blinded everyone who was watching the battle. Even the guards who ran towards the two fighting to stop them fell on their backs, and then tried to see through the dust who was still standing. And when she lay down, everyone saw Roy, resting his spear on the stone, leaning on it with trembling legs, while Joshua began to fall face down on the ground. Staring hard at the ground, Roy breathed heavily, his body shaking as he tried to keep the boy conscious. And Joshua, falling to the ground, spat out several clots of blood and lost consciousness, having no way to continue such an important fight. The entire arena, including the stands, seemed to have frozen in time, and people were trying to comprehend the seriousness of what had just happened before their eyes. Finally, having overcome the weakness that pierced his entire body, Roy, still clutching the spear in his hands, straightened up, looking down at the one who had lost to him in such a fierce fight. And Joshua, without regaining consciousness, finally really lost. And not only in the fight, but also in the comparison of two completely different views on life and the structure of the world. Suddenly, realizing that they had just witnessed the culmination of the most amazing fight in recent years, the spectators cried out, congratulating the winner. Each of them began chanting the name of the one who had defeated the undisputed favorite. And even Aura, who was standing among the spectators, could not believe her eyes. Looking at her only student in amazement, Aura couldn't believe that Roy, who had failed to block her magical attack 2 weeks ago, had now imbued the spear with mana himself. And although a smile appeared on her face from the understanding that she had definitely not made a mistake in choosing a student, the belief in what had happened could not fit into her mind. Suddenly, she remembered the strange man who had bet on Roy's victory in this tournament, and she looked around, unmistakably spotting him among the crowd. She tried to make out his face, at the same time trying to understand how this man had guessed that Roy would be the winner. Throwing back his hood, the young man that Aura saw for the first time in her life exclaimed in surprise, shouting about the impossibility of Roy's victory. And although she was also very surprised by what happened, his violent reaction confused the girl a little, confusing her because he himself had bet on the spearman's victory. Suddenly, she thought again that this huge bet on the victory of someone who had shown himself to the awakened community for the first time was even stranger than she had first thought. She turned towards the guy again, wanting to approach him and ask him questions. But he, unexpectedly for the girl, disappeared, leaving no trace behind. Raising her eyebrows in surprise, she thought that the guy was behaving even too strangely. But now, alas, she would not be able to find out the reasons for such behavior. Evening came, and Roy, with his head down, walked away from the tournament site with heavy thoughts. For the first time since he started his heavy physical training, the boy was so tired that it was incredibly difficult to keep his eyes open and his legs steady. Moreover, the joy of victory was marred by very unpleasant news from the tournament organizers, who announced that Roy was disqualified from the tournament. Just before his fight with Joshua, the latter withdrew from the tournament. And although he behaved terribly, Roy got into a fight with him, even though the referees tried to stop him. Shaking his head sternly and sighing, the organizers said that Roy had thereby violated the rules of the tournament, and therefore had no right to the win he deserved. And although the guy couldn't stop thinking about the fact that the desired purchase had slipped through his fingers, he still asked how Joshua was feeling. The organizers said that he remained alive, although he was also disqualified despite his desire to withdraw from the tournament, and his magical attack would be considered an attempt to commit murder. Deciding that he was upset by recent events, Roy looked at his phone and saw that the progress of the lectures after the fight with Joshua had advanced greatly. The boy thought that the feeling that Xiang Yu himself was fighting shoulder to shoulder with Roy was caused by the fact that he had crossed the 50% mark in his lectures. After some thought, the guy thought that perhaps he should sign up for another course, because with increasing progress, it was becoming easier and easier for him. But as soon as he opened the tab with lectures, a girl pulled him by the shoulder, and Roy, turning around, recognized Aura. After a difficult and dangerous fight, the girl was very worried about her student, and therefore asked how he felt, to which the guy grinned and asked not to worry. Realizing that Roy wasn't particularly hurt, although he was very tired, Aura sighed in relief, no longer worrying in vain. In turn, Roy, seeing how much the girl was worried, guiltily scratched the back of his head and asked her for forgiveness out loud, which greatly surprised Aura. Looking down in disappointment, he added that he would have definitely won if he had just not interfered where he shouldn't have. But now, because of him, her academy would not raise its level. The girl shook her head and said that he had absolutely no reason to worry about such trifles, and he had done absolutely the right thing, which surprised the spearman. However, the girl smirked and said that he had expected to win not because of her academy, but only because of her promise to give him the cash prize. It turned out that only now did Roy remember that a huge amount of money had slipped from his hands, and he cried out in despair because he had lost so much. In a panic, he thought that not only would he not be able to buy the Spear of Longinus, but he would also not have time to extend his absences from his teacher's lectures. Of course, he did not express his thoughts out loud, and when the girl asked what he was going to spend them on, he sadly replied that he really wanted to buy one very good spear. Suddenly, the guy sighed and stood up on both feet, sadly noting that there was nothing he could do now, and therefore there was no point in grieving. And although he was sure that he had done the right thing, he couldn't help but notice that he would be lying if he said that he didn't regret anything at all. And then, to Aura's curiosity, he added that if he hadn't come out to defend his friend then, he would have regretted it much more. Roy scratched his head and said that the money issue would be resolved somehow, and Aura supported him when they suddenly heard a greeting from Fred. Turning around, they saw a guy with broken glasses and a bandage on his head shouting Roy's name, attracting the attention of his comrade. Trying to catch his breath after a short run in search of his friend, Fred asked if Roy was going to leave now, and he answered, yes, and Aura covered herself with her cap. Roy asked what had happened that made him run after him without even coming to his senses, and Fred, scratching the back of his head and stumbling, tried to find what to answer. He even swallowed from excitement, and all the thoughts that he had been forming for so long before the meeting suddenly left his mind. Finally, the guy gathered his strength, sighed, straightened up, and firmly asked his friend if he could become just as strong if he trained long and hard. And Roy, hearing this question, froze in place, realizing what an effort it had cost Fred to ask it. He thought about looking into his comrade's eyes and saw in them a firm determination to become much stronger than he was now, no matter what. Roy allowed himself to remain silent for a few seconds, trying to form a worthy answer that would help his friend achieve his goal. Finally, he sighed, looked into Fred's eyes just as firmly, and said that it was possible, although it would be terribly difficult for him to achieve it. Roy reasoned to himself that Fred really lacked talent, and dreams and desires alone wouldn't get you very far in this cruel world. After thinking about it, the guy added that there are a lot of professions in the world, and Fred doesn't have to concentrate only on being a hunter, which made him smile. Finally, after apologizing for embarrassing his friend, Fred said goodbye to Roy and, hiding his smile, walked away. Suddenly, Roy screamed, calling on his friend to never let anyone tell him what to do with his life, not even a comrade. Fred, who was about to leave, froze in place, and without turning around, listened to what Roy was telling him. Noticing that his friend was listening, the boy continued, exclaiming that everyone would tell him that he had no talent or future, and that he had to give up. Fred turned around and looked into the eyes of his screaming friend, who finished the thought by claiming that it was his life, and no one had the right to tell him what he could and couldn't do. The guy lowered his voice and added that if Fred wanted something, he should just do it, and the rest didn't matter. And these words brought tears to the guy's eyes. A few minutes later, they finally said goodbye, and Fred promised to definitely visit his friend, and together with his little sister. Watching the guy with glasses leave, Aura noticed that she was pleasantly surprised, and Roy, embarrassed, walked away, replying that he was always sticking his nose into other people's business. Aura chuckled and joked that she didn't see anything wrong with that, since Roy had also acquired his first and most loyal fan, which made him laugh. The guy noted that the students were better than the fans, and Aura suddenly stopped laughing, remembering that she had completely forgotten to take the opportunity to invite Fred to her academy. For some reason, this thought made her turn towards Roy, who was already moving at a leisurely pace, apparently towards the house. She looked at him, who was scratching the back of his head, wondering where he could get money now, with a kind and warm look. And then she corrected herself with a smile, saying that now this academy is not only hers. Having run up to the student, the girl, crossing her arms behind her back, praised him in a friendly manner for his efforts today, and offered to buy him a new spear, which greatly surprised the guy. At the same time, in another part of the city, on the territory of one estate, no less intriguing events were taking place. A certain man walked briskly along the corridor of the estate, built in the old Japanese style, intending to solve the task at hand as quickly as possible. Having lost one arm, but not letting this fact get in the way, the man approached the guard and asked if the master was in. Having received an affirmative answer and not wanting to listen to any additions, he demanded that he be let through immediately, since his business could not tolerate delay. The guard tried to argue, but could not find an answer and opened the door leading to the private quarters of the owner of the estate. Upon entering and seeing the master meditating, the man fell to his knees before him and introduced himself to him as Robert. In a deep, though slightly hoarse from age voice, the man who was the great swordsman indicated that he asked not to be disturbed. Even without turning around, the old man radiated a threatening aura, and with his accusation that a man dared to disobey orders, he caused real fear in his assistant. Feeling the incredible pressure of the great swordsman's powerful aura, the man couldn't even move. However, barely gathering his strength, the man said in a trembling voice that the master's granddaughter had participated in the academy tournament, which attracted the swordsman's attention. He even relaxed his intimidating aura a little, asking again if he had heard everything correctly when the assistant confirmed the information. While Aura was helping Roy make a choice to buy a new spear, the man answered the master that they had not yet figured out everything. He noted that the great swordsman's granddaughter apparently had a new student who had managed to get into the tournament in a very short time. The master suddenly stood up, and Robert tried to say that he could handle everything himself. But Guy Bauer responded with a firm refusal. Turning around and scratching his gray beard, the old man said that he simply had to see for himself the person who had agreed to study at his granddaughter's academy. The next day, Roy arrived at the academy at the crack of dawn, devoting hours to exhausting body training. For the 5,000th time that morning, he swung his spear, cutting through the air with such force that the shaft vibrated with tension. Wiping the sweat from his forehead, the boy was glad that he had managed to complete the Hegemon King's daily task while Aura stood behind him with an uncomprehending look. And although the guy tried not to pay attention to her, he couldn't help but admit that her close attention was distracting him too much. Finally, the guy turned around and asked the girl directly why she had suddenly started to glare at him with such a displeased look. Although the girl did not agree with this, although she noted in a clearly displeased tone that she still remembered how he spent several hours yesterday choosing a new spear for himself, and in the end, left with nothing. Roy tried to say that he was simply not worthy of such a gift, but Aura shut him up and noted that he was clearly not the type to refuse something like that so easily. Roy remembered trying to outsmart the system and ask Aura for money to buy a spear, but the price went up, and he realized that money earned dishonestly didn't count. She tried to reproach him for the fact that Roy was not taking advantage of her generosity, which upset her. But suddenly she noticed a guy's strange reaction to her own thoughts. Deciding to change the subject, Aura asked Roy what kind of mana-enhancing technique he used back in the tournament, to which Roy only asked what she meant. She reminded him of his last and strongest blow yesterday, but Roy only looked at her silently, waiting for an explanation. The girl tried to point out that she had seen yesterday's fight with her own eyes, and that Roy was clearly not moving like a newbie, to which the guy said that he didn't know how to focus mana at all. Not understanding how Roy could not understand the techniques he himself used, she nevertheless decided to explain that the mana amplification technique allows one to use it most effectively. She said that there are many types of this technique, and depending on their effectiveness, they are all divided into different levels from the lowest to the highest. She also noted that all hunters usually have their own technology, and some even patent it. And Roy thought to himself that this was why he really wanted to get into the elite academy. He decided to check just in case if Aura was teaching the great swordsman's mana enhancement technique. But the girl only shook her head sadly, noting that her grandfather forbade it. Instead, she offered to teach the guy her own technique, which surprised Roy very much because he had no idea that she had her own technique. Frowning at the thought, the boy thought that he really should learn how to use mana, because yesterday at the tournament, he clearly felt how much he needed it. In parallel with his discussion of Aura, the boy was thinking that since he was making such rapid progress in learning Chiron and Xiang Yu's techniques, he should take lectures on mana as well. Without waiting for an answer, the girl turned away irritably and waved her hand, deciding that if the guy was talking for so long, it meant he wasn't interested. However, Roy asked her where she was going when the girl wished him luck with his training. Aura replied that she was going on business since he didn't want to learn the technique from her, to which Roy laughed, saying that he didn't expect her to be so businesslike. Still smiling after his own joke, the guy said goodbye to the girl, and then suddenly became serious, wondering which course he should choose. After leaving the grounds of her academy, Aura blushed in indignation, trying to figure out if she really looked like she had nothing better to do. Having opened the next lecture, Roy listened with interest to the gray-haired old man in a huge hat and with a strong staff in front of whom books were levitating. Roy still couldn't get used to the fact that the teachers of the Transcendent Academy were legendary heroes of reality or myth, and was quite surprised to recognize Merlin in the Elder. Watching his lectures, Roy even felt sad, realizing that, although a genius, the terribly old wizard still expressed himself so incomprehensibly that he could compete with Buddha. At one point, the teacher finished with the explanations, and Roy, realizing that he had not understood anything at all, prepared himself to be forced to do his homework. And so it happened, because Merlin, without getting the message across to his student at all, gave him the task of creating a whole 1,000 spheres of mana by the end of the day. Realizing that there was nothing to do and that he would have to complete the task, Roy tried to organize all the information he had received in his mind and focus the mana in his body. Thinking that he was probably only able to sense mana thanks to Chiron's lectures, Roy tried to transfer its flows into his hands and create a sphere. Realizing that he was having an incredibly difficult time giving his mana a form, Roy suddenly heard Merlin's voice right next to his ear, urging the boy to use the full power of his imagination. He told Roy to trick the universe into thinking that everything he came up with and tried to implement actually worked according to its laws. Roy felt a surge of understanding when Merlin exclaimed that the very nature of mana was the most vivid example of the human mind's ability to deceive reality. And the moment Roy was able to fully comprehend this fact, mana flowed from his fingers into the center of the joint of his hands, forming a magical sphere. And although the guy still managed to form it, which greatly pleased and surprised him, he noticed that the sphere turned out to be quite small. Raising his hand with the mana to his eyes, Roy was amazed at how tiny it was, and also how obviously weak it was, which is why it did not maintain the shape of a sphere. Though he thought that such a weak sphere would hardly be accepted, Roy nevertheless smiled at the successful result, although he felt that Merlin would be displeased. Looking at the result, albeit pathetic, Roy thought that in the future he would certainly do much better. Suddenly, a commanding but slightly hoarse voice called out to the guy, and he had to be distracted from his undoubtedly important task. Turning to the man who had called Roy, the boy peered into his face, trying to figure out who it was and what he was doing at Aura Academy. Looking closely at the old man's face, Roy suddenly realized that he knew very well who he was. Standing before him was none other than the great swordsman himself, who was not only one of the most legendary heroes but also Aura's grandfather, and his gaze was quite serious. And although Guy Bauer looked quite menacing, he thought to himself that Roy clearly had talent, since he was able to form a clot of mana in his hand. Frowning, the man was truly angry when he realized that such a talented student could come to this academy just to use his granddaughter. The man was so angry that his powerful aura was released and began to absorb everything around him, causing Roy to lose his strength. However, the guy managed to resist the oppressive aura and, keeping his voice firm, greeted the old man, introducing himself. And although the aura didn't affect the guy, the knowledge of the authority of the person who came scared him a little, and he thought that he didn't expect to meet him here at all. Suddenly, the boy stopped smiling welcomingly and guessed that the old man had probably come to see his granddaughter, and then said that she had gone out on business. And with his words, he greatly surprised the man, because in their country they only address close people by name, and therefore Guy was a little taken aback. Looking up at Roy with an uncomprehending gaze, the man looked at his body and asked out loud why he didn't fall to his knees, which surprised the guy a little. Roy asked again why he had to fall to his knees, and Guy replied that his aura paralyzed everyone who had not reached S-class level. Roy looked at his body curiously and, looking away from the man, wondered if perhaps the Buddha skill was helping him hold on. Drawing attention to himself again, Guy asked what Roy was doing there, which caused confusion in the guy, who immediately asked again what the man meant. Placing his hand on the sheath of his blade, Guy said that with such talent, the boy would be accepted into any academy. And so he asked what exactly he needed from his granddaughter. And with a look full of severity, the old man began to approach Roy, threatening him not to dare lie, because in that case he would have to use a weapon. Roy even had to cover himself to overcome the great swordsman's increased wrathful aura. Raising his hands, Roy raised his hands, trying to say that the great swordsman had completely misunderstood everything, and that there had been some kind of misunderstanding. Suddenly, Guy spoke without any hoarseness or weakness, in a firm and hard voice, claiming that he did not expect to hear an answer so simply. Suddenly, the old man swung his blade, causing the boy to panic and dodge and run away. Casting an arrogant and displeased glance at the boy, the man twisted the blade in his hand, preparing to attack again if he didn't receive an answer. In turn, Roy, with panic in his eyes and mind, tried to figure out what to do, because he clearly would not be able to defeat the great swordsman. At the same time, Aura finally reached the family estate and was very surprised to learn that her grandfather, to whom she had come, had already left. A little upset, she asked one of the workers when he would return, but the girl said that she did not know, and it would be better to call the assistant foreman. Sighing sadly, Aura thought that she had just wanted to tell Grandpa Guy about what an amazing student she had received. At the same time, the great swordsman, having bared his legendary blade, pressed Roy, demanding answers to his questions. Roy realized that he couldn't run away for long, and so, reaching his spear, he raised it and tried to focus on the sudden enemy. At the same time, Aura, being in the family estate, asked the worker to contact the master's personal assistant. But the man just approached the girl. Smiling joyfully and kindly, Robert greeted the girl, noting that she had not visited them for quite a long time. The worker bowed and was about to leave, and Robert noted that Aura had come in just in time, since he was about to call her himself. She asked why she should call, since she herself had decided to come to her grandfather. And Robert swallowed, learning the purpose of the girl's arrival. Lowering his voice a little, the man said that her grandfather had just gone to her academy. And Aura was speechless upon realizing what had happened. At that very moment, she took off without even saying goodbye, intending to return to the academy as quickly as possible. The worker, who had not yet left, excitedly asked the man where the girl had run, but he only watched Aura with a frowning look, without answering. Aura hurried back with all her might, scolding herself for letting her guard down, and, even knowing that her grandfather would definitely come, missing this moment. With great excitement in her mind, the girl ran, hoping that she would make it to the academy before something terrible happened. At the same time, Roy, tensing his whole body, did not take his eyes off his opponent, realizing that otherwise he could die. And Guy Bauer continued to look at the guy with arrogance and toughness, still striving to get answers to his questions. There was tension in the air between the two men, ready to fight, as Guy was not going to back down without getting answers. And Roy was trying to protect himself from danger. He tried to understand how it was possible that one of his idols was trying to kill him right now, without listening to any arguments. Before this, the guy hadn't noticed, but now, looking at the old man's weapon, Roy noticed that the man hadn't even pulled the blade out of its sheath. Clutching his spear tightly and tensing his legs to be able to dodge if necessary, Roy noticed that Guy was not trying to kill him, but simply subdue him. Having calmed down a little, the great swordsman noticed that the guy was really ready to fight, and so he asked again who he was. And Roy began to make excuses again. While Roy tried to explain to the man that he had misunderstood everything, the swordsman noted that the guy knew how to control mana, moved well, and continued to try to talk. The man sighed and fell silent for a few seconds, and the boy began to hope that their fight would end now and they would be able to talk. However, the moment Roy allowed himself to relax even a little, the old man attacked him, forcing him to defend himself and shouting that the guy was lying to him without any shame. Moving away from the man, Roy twisted his spear and, gritting his teeth, said that he didn't know what Aura had said to the man, but he clearly had misunderstood everything. And although the boy thought that his words sounded quite logical, Guy screamed, calling him a scoundrel and making it clear that he did not believe his words at all. The man's eyes flashed with anger as he said he just wanted to talk and find out what brought the boy to the academy. But his lie left the old man with no choice. The boy cried out that the man was lying, since he clearly had no intention of discussing anything. And then, straightening up, he grabbed the spear more comfortably, preparing to accept the fight. Realizing that the man would not talk, Roy decided that it would be better to fight, even if the old man did not intend to kill the guy. He knew that the man was not thinking about murder only because he clearly understood that if he had the opposite desire in his mind, Roy would be dead that very moment. The boy tried to understand how he could fight against such a strong opponent, because the great swordsman was so strong that it was unlikely that there would be even one opponent equal to him. But at that very moment, the guy became excited, realizing that he had received an incredible chance to fight with the legendary hero. Looking at the guy, Guy noticed that his aura had changed, which meant that he was going to fight seriously, which simultaneously insulted the man and made him respect him. The old man thought that during his long life he had seen many hunters, but in all that time, only one of them had found the strength to look him in the eyes without fear. And based on this, the swordsman decided that Roy must really be very strong, since he could afford not to show fear in such a situation. But the old man did not allow respect to interfere with his thinking and, rushing forward, struck the shaft of the spear with lightning speed, asking himself what the boy wanted from his granddaughter. Gritting his teeth in tension, Roy noted that his opponent was so strong that he couldn't even feel his attacks. Looking up from where the swordsman had struck and back at his opponent, Roy's eyes widened in shock. He hadn't yet noticed how the enemy had pulled the weapon back, and the swordsman had already swung for a second attack, which the guy didn't even have time to prepare for. Trying hard to keep up with the speed of the true master, Roy gritted his teeth, moving the spear from one side to the other, realizing that he didn't even have a chance to attack. The guy used all his speed to defend himself and try to keep his eyes on his opponent. But even so, he sometimes missed attacks. And even so, seeing at one moment that the old man had allowed himself to be exposed, Roy suddenly rushed forward, preparing to deliver a desperate blow. However, Guy reacted instantly and easily blocked the guy's attack without even moving, thus showing how much stronger he was. Having intercepted the blow and moved the boy's spear to the side, the old man continued to move his sword, aiming the handle of the blade at the enemy's side. Chuckling and not even moving his torso, Guy with the same light movement hit the guy so hard that he flew to the side, which slightly disappointed the swordsman. Falling to the ground and trying to control his ragged breathing, Roy desperately tried to figure out how to fight on. As he fell and dropped the spear, he felt that the blow was incredibly powerful, and it was truly impossible to resist the man at this level. Clearing his throat and rising to one knee, Roy grabbed his spear and looked up at his opponent, thinking that although the enemy was strong, as long as he was not fighting seriously, there was a chance. As he thought that he simply had to strike at least once, Roy saw that the swordsman had already gotten within striking distance of him and was swinging his blade. And at the same moment the boy noticed the sword approaching his face, he suddenly felt something strange inside himself. Leaning his torso back, Roy managed to dodge the attack, waiting for the window to open that he could use to successfully attack. Shifting his feet to maintain his balance, Roy swung his spear and aimed it at the enemy, attempting to counterattack. And at that very moment, the boy suddenly heard Merlin's voice, convincing him that he had to make the fruit of his imagination become reality, deceiving the laws of the universe. Listening to his teacher's voice, Roy concentrated on the feeling of mana in his body, focusing it into his weapon and strike. To the surprise of the great swordsman, the boy swung this spear, imbued with magical energy. Having swung properly, Roy followed through with his blow, not letting go of the hope that this blow would definitely reach its target. And the guy really succeeded. And the attack was so powerful that the magical power spread like a wave throughout the room. But unfortunately for Roy, although the attack was powerful, Guy defended himself without much difficulty. And the guy, having spent all his strength on the blow, fell to his knees. The man glared at the boy who had been knocked down after an unsuccessful, albeit quite impressive, attack. Roy looked up, breathing heavily, waiting to see what would happen next. And the man cried out that the boy had shown his true colors, to which Roy replied that the old man had actually attacked first. Sighing, the spearman expressed his hope that Aura would return soon, which angered the old man even more. Gripping the hilt of the sword tighter, the man began to emit a murderous aura again, and said that the guy had definitely played too much. Approaching the enemy, he furiously shouted that since Roy was asking for it, the swordsman would personally send him to the next world. Grabbing the spear again, the boy raised it, afraid that the next blow would actually kill him. But before the great swordsman could launch a devastating attack, Aura burst into the room, shouting for both of them to stop fighting. Still unable to relax, Roy, spear at the ready, turned to the girl, asking what they had done. Aura turned to her grandfather with a stern look, and it was clear that the girl was truly angry. To the old man's surprise, the girl first rushed to Roy, not to him, and asked with concern how he was feeling, noticing that he had bruises, even feeling a little jealous of his granddaughter's attention to the guy. Guy allowed himself to say that he didn't consider him a man, and the guy was indignant. He said that the old man probably didn't care who he hit, and when the man, indignant, demanded to repeat it, Roy quickly hid behind Aura's back. To her own surprise, the girl noted that this was the first time she had heard anyone talk to her grandfather like that. Finally, realizing that as long as Aura was here, the swordsman wouldn't touch him, Roy asked again why the old man had decided to attack him in the first place. The warrior was about to take out his sword again and punish the scoundrel for his big mouth, but Aura stopped him, demanding that he stop this farce. Turning to her student, the girl asked him for forgiveness for what he had gotten into, although Roy did not understand why she was the one apologizing. And although he said that he only got a couple of bruises and that she had nothing to do with it, Aura bowed her head and said that she was terribly guilty before him. Seeing this gesture, the guy was taken aback, and then he looked up and looked at the old man standing behind his girlfriend. Roy saw that the man was still terribly dissatisfied and felt no remorse at all, while his granddaughter was sadly remorseful. Thinking that perhaps the relatives needed to talk to each other in private, and he was just getting in the way, Roy said he was going to the emergency room, and Aura apologized again. Having once again said that the girl was not to blame, The guy said goodbye to her and left, causing her to smile as gratitude for her understanding. And when the door closed behind Roy, Aura sighed and turned, throwing a clearly very displeased look at her grandfather. And although the swordsman still looked very angry, Aura spoke to him, trying to speak softly and not to overdo it, although it was hard to hide her indignation. Finally, sighing, she lowered her gaze slightly and, collecting her thoughts, informed the old man that she had a very important topic to talk about with him. But as soon as she gathered her strength and looked up, she immediately froze in place, losing the opportunity to say anything to her grandfather. After not hearing a word from his granddaughter, the man said that Roy seemed very suspicious to him, which finally helped the girl to speak up, claiming that she did not agree with him. Snorting, the swordsman asked how the girl could suddenly know this, causing her to get angry and clench her fist, indignant at what she heard. She thought sadly about how her grandfather always interfered in her life, and even those students who came to her academy, he always frightened them, hindering her. Swallowing, realizing how hard it was for her to talk to him openly, she tried to continue. Sighing, the man looked away and told her to throw the guy out of the academy tomorrow. Otherwise, he would take action. However, before he could finish, the girl interrupted him, saying that she did not want to and would not do this. The man tried to silence her with his stern gaze, but she continued, claiming that Roy was not as the swordsman saw him. He tried to ask again, not understanding how his granddaughter dared to suddenly contradict his will. But Aura shouted at him that she was not going to follow his order. Suddenly, she began to scream louder, claiming that she had listened to her grandfather all her life, but she did not want to let Roy go, and did not see any point in fulfilling the old man's will. Barely holding back tears from the overwhelming emotions, the girl continued, shouting that this was her academy, not his, and it was not up to him to choose who would study there. She thought to herself that she had known Roy for less than a month, and they had spent little time together. But she felt absolutely wonderful with him. She thought that she didn't want to let him go, but on the contrary, she wanted to be with him as long as possible. The man tried to answer his granddaughter and shouted, claiming that she did not understand what kind of person he was. But Aura interrupted him again, asking what of it. She said that this is her first student with whom she feels truly good, and she wants this to continue, and she does not need her grandfather's control at all. Aura shouted that she was tired of living in the shadow of her world-famous grandfather and was going to build her own life without his influence. Eventually, the rage wore off and the girl suddenly fell silent, realizing how much she had said to her grandfather. And so she looked up at him. To her surprise, the old man stopped interrupting her for the first time in her life and was now looking at his granddaughter, surprised that she was able to tell him everything to his face. Sighing and looking away with a guilty look, Aura apologized to her grandfather for raising her voice at him, even though he didn't ask for it. Without waiting for an answer, the girl headed out of the training room, adding that this time she would do things her own way. Guy Bauer stood motionless as he watched the girl leave, still amazed at the fact that his granddaughter had shown such a strong character in his presence. Looking at the already closed door in amazement, the man noticed that she had never screamed in his presence. The swordsman remembered how several years ago, a portal to the dungeon suddenly opened in the center of the city and monsters came out, causing a catastrophe. On that very horrific day, Guy learned that his beloved son had died in a tragedy that had occurred. On that very day, the great swordsman experienced true despair, having lost the one for whom he was ready to give his own life. And a few days later, he also learned that his granddaughter was alive, although she was left completely alone. The girl was still little, and without parents she was threatened with a future in an orphanage, which the man could not allow under any circumstances. Looking at the girl on the day his son was buried, Guy realized that he was seeing before him the last person in whose veins his own blood flowed, and he was so afraid that the girl might for some reason end up in danger that he promised himself that he would definitely teach her his techniques. He knew very well that the girl did not like fencing, but he could not allow himself to be more gentle with her, because it was precisely with this strictness that he wanted to strengthen his granddaughter's character. Even when Aura, who had already grown up, told her grandfather that she wanted to be a teacher, he continued to be strict with her, no longer imagining that it was possible to act differently. Fearing for her life and future, Guy shouted at the girl to do only as he wanted, and thus distanced himself from her. The man suddenly realized that he had turned the girl against himself, and although he had suspected that this would happen, he did not want to allow himself to think about it. In the end, wanting to protect his beloved granddaughter, he made it so that now she would under no circumstances ask for his help. Sighing, the man realized that he had brought both himself and the girl into this truly sad situation, and it would be very difficult to fix it. He realized that on that very day, Aura had found the strength to refuse her grandfather's will, and now he was left all alone. The next day, Roy stretched his shoulders as he headed to training, noting that in just one night, the aches in his entire body had disappeared. After the fight with the great swordsman, Roy, surprisingly, remained without a single injury, and the only evidence of this fight were small bruises that healed overnight. He smiled as he remembered how difficult it was to fight such a strong opponent, and he was incredibly lucky that Aura had come running to protect him. Suddenly stopping smiling, the guy thought that he had no idea until yesterday how hard his girlfriend's life was. He remembered how, when he got home, Aura called him and, asking for forgiveness once again, explained what had happened. She told him in great detail what kind of relationship she had with her grandfather, and the guy didn't like what he heard at all. And while Roy wasn't afraid of the great swordsman at all, Aura revealed that her other students weren't like that, and left the academy out of fear of her grandfather. And although Roy felt that the girl had clearly omitted a lot, he had enough information to understand what kind of relationship she had with her grandfather, and why he suddenly attacked the guy. However, at the same time, although the spearman understood why Guy treated him so aggressively, he did not agree with this approach at all, and therefore did not forgive him at all. And although Roy managed to gain a lot of experience during this incredibly difficult and unsuccessful fight, he thought with a grin that he would not try to fight him anymore. And then he suddenly changed his mind, deciding that getting so much experience for beating sounded like a pretty interesting idea. Finally, the guy reached the academy and, entering the training hall, immediately said hello, expecting that Aura would meet him. However, for some reason, the guy, sitting on the floor with his legs crossed, was met by the great swordsman himself, who greeted the guy sullenly and noted with displeasure that he was in no hurry. Roy looked at the old man in amazement, thinking only that the desire to be beaten for progressing in lectures was just a joke. A couple of minutes later, Roy was already sitting in front of the great swordsman, telling him all the conditions of their acquaintance and friendship with Aura. The man irritably asked again whether Roy had hidden any details from him, to which the guy angrily asked him to finally stop suspecting him. And although Guy finally realized that the guy wasn't lying, he still couldn't understand where this guy got so much strength and talent from. The old man stroked his beard sullenly and noted that he actually respected the fact that the guy had not been scared in their last fight, but had stepped forward. Roy asked if he could finally go since he needed to get back to training, and Guy was just waiting for that, and happily allowed himself a smile. He decided that he would let the boy train while he watched, and thus learn the secrets of his talent and skills. But what he saw left the old man dumbfounded. At first, he thought he didn't understand something, but then he realized that something was really wrong with the guy, because he had been looking at the switched-off phone for several minutes. Guy frowned at Roy, crossed his arms in front of him, and asked if the guy really meditated like that, although the guy didn't understand the question at all. When the man asked again, Roy said that he really did meditate, and the old man indignantly said that meditation was a good practice, but it did not develop the body at all. And although Guy wanted to motivate the guy to get down to business, Roy only echoed his words and continued to look at the turned-off screen, surprising the man. The man was quite interested in the fact that Roy was not at all interested in the great swordsman's desire to teach him something, and so he seriously thought about teaching the guy. Hearing a clear offer to train, Roy was even surprised, asking again if the great swordsman himself really wanted to teach him, which finally pleased the man, who had expected such a reaction. The man thought that he had only suggested this because the boy had hurt his pride, and so he was already thinking about what he could teach him. But Roy suddenly said that he would probably refuse. Suddenly, Aura entered the training room, quickly greeting the guy and starting to talk to him about yesterday, but quickly interrupted. She saw Roy sitting on his phone as usual, and her grandfather standing over him, frowning and trying to figure out the secret. Turning to the girl, the man greeted her, noting that she, like Roy, was in no particular hurry, although he was actually waiting. The girl already wanted to aggressively kick the old man out, threatening him not to touch Roy under any circumstances. But the old man interrupted her, whispering that the guy was clearly not all there. Having stopped mid-sentence, Aura's eyes widened in shock as she listened to the old man's outrage at the boy's refusal to be trained by the great swordsman himself. Then the man pointed at the guy, who was staring at his switched-off phone, and gloomily noted that he was clearly crazy. However, Aura shrugged in response and noted with a grin that she didn't see anything strange in this situation, since the guy always behaved like this. Guy looked at the girl with confusion, but she continued to smile, saying that at first she also thought the guy was crazy. And although the man clearly didn't understand anything, Aura shrugged and walked towards the guy with a smile, greeting him again. Taking his eyes off his phone, the guy greeted the girl, asking how long ago she had arrived, and hearing in response that she had literally just come in. Guy thought again the already boring thought that he didn't like the guy. But then he admitted that in his company his granddaughter smiled, which was a rare occurrence. The old man could not help but admit that he himself liked it when his granddaughter was happy, and it brought him peace of mind. Pursing his lips and looking curiously at his friends as they chatted, the man asked himself seriously if she really liked talking to him. And while his friends were laughing merrily, the man thought sadly that Aura never laughed in his company, and this upset him. And while the man couldn't agree that Roy was a good guy, he did agree with another fact, which was that he could actually create joy in his granddaughter's soul. And although the man noted these thoughts with some sadness, at the same time he was very jealous of this rascal, who, unlike the old man, could bring a smile to the girl's face. Suddenly, distracting the swordsman from his thoughts, his assistant burst into the room with obvious alarm on his face, trying to attract the master's attention to himself. The man turned around, asking what was wrong, and even Aura and Roy stopped talking, curious about what had happened. However, it turned out that, despite the anxious expression on Robert's face, he actually wanted to inform the man that he was being invited to the Order of Truth. Calling the gathering a bunch of weirdos, the man said that if they wanted him, they could come themselves, but he wasn't going anywhere. However, Robert then noted that it was not all members of the Order who were calling him, but a certain Sir Kalia, which interested the great swordsman. The assistant said that he was informed that Sir Kalia had some personal questions for the master, as well as one request. And to the surprise of everyone present, it turned out that Kalia asked Guy to bring Roy with him, which made the guy go dumbfounded, his eyes wide open. Just in case, he pointed to his face, and with a voice full of surprise, he asked again if it was really him who was being summoned along with the great swordsman. As he stood up, shrugging his shoulders and thinking that he apparently had no choice, he realized that the same question was on the minds of everyone present. Everyone was wondering why Roy was being called in, but Guy suddenly shouted that Roy was actually Kalia's henchman, causing confusion and slight indignation from the guy, who denied the accusations. Aura suddenly slapped her fist against her palm and remembered that during the tournament, she had seen a strange man in a black cloak. Lost in thought and pressing her fingers to her mouth, the girl began to think, suggesting that this man could be connected to Sir Kalia's circle. Roy listened silently as everyone speculated about why he had suddenly been called into such company, and then asked if he really had to go, since he didn't feel like it. Aura, amazed, even opened her mouth in surprise, telling the guy that the Order of Truth is actually one of the most famous societies in the world. She noted that it included 7 apostles whose power was equal to that of the rulers of states, and that Sir Kalia was the successor of the Apostle of Chastity and did not usually make appointments. To the surprise of everyone present, Roy suddenly shrugged his shoulders in response to this information and said that he didn't care about it, and it would be better for him to continue training. Robert suddenly chuckled and said that this was the reason why everyone around him thought so highly of Sir Kalia, which caused misunderstanding among Aura, Guy, and Roy. The great swordsman crossed his arms over his chest and then asked what he meant, and Robert said that Sir Kalia had predicted Roy's refusal in advance. Chuckling and smiling as he realized that Sir Kalia was truly amazing, Robert said that the apostle had conveyed a different message for this occasion. He conveyed that Sir Kalia promised Roy a whole $100,000 if he agreed to show up for this personal meeting. It turned out that the Order of Truth is a kind of religious organization, only their faith is based not on any of the gods, but on truth itself. The man in the robe who came to the tournament and bet on Roy's victory had the title of Great Voice. And at the head of the order there are 7 people, namely the apostles of humility, diligence, chastity, abstinence, gratitude, mercy, and patience. It is now believed that the apostles interpret the will and opinion of God, and therefore the truth itself, although previously they were seen as nothing more than a strange cult. But when the cataclysm occurred, summoning dungeons, monsters, and the power of the awakened, the servants of the Order united with the heroes to confront the monsters. And the Order received real power when it destroyed the most powerful berserker giant, who had been terrorizing the world for a long time and whom the heroes could not defeat. And in modern times, the great swordsman Guy Bauer, accompanied by Roy, finally reached the hotel where the representatives of the Order were staying. When they saw one of the servants, Guy wanted to introduce Roy, but the man in the robe said that he knew everything about the spearman who had appeared. Taking a step to the side, the man extended his hand towards the door and invited the 2 men to enter, claiming that Sir Kalia was already waiting for them. The whole time they were getting to the hotel, Roy was trying to figure out how this Kalia guy had guessed exactly how much money he needed. And then he thought it was all because of the tournament. The guy decided that he was offered the amount he was supposed to win at the tournament, but he couldn't understand why he had interested someone so important. Eventually, after walking through a long corridor, a man in a robe opened the door to a very prestigious-looking room for them and let the men in, claiming that Sir Kalia would be there soon. As Roy and Guy sat down, the swordsman allowed himself to clear his throat and gloomily remark that he had known they would have to wait, and that Kalia would never have arrived first. Wanting to satisfy his curiosity, Roy asked Guy if they had met Sir Kalia before, which caused the old man a little surprise. Sighing and frowning in displeasure, the man said that they would meet for the first time that day, and Roy's eyes widened in surprise. The guy said that he thought they had known each other for a long time, and Guy, sighing, noted that Kalia had been inviting him to his place for a long time, but the old man always refused. And although the man had met the Apostle of Chastity before, he had not yet met his successor, and Roy nodded his head understandingly. The guy thought that he saw his girlfriend's grandfather in him, but he shouldn't forget that he was still the great swordsman. And so the guy asked if the man knew the Great Voice. Roy said that he had heard that the Great Voice only appeared in public when the Order was fighting against a great monster. And Guy frowned, slightly embarrassed. Propping his head on his fist, the man said that he had never communicated or interacted with the Great Voice in person, but had only seen it from afar. Suddenly, they had to interrupt their conversation when they heard footsteps outside one of the doors of the room. A rather young guy with blonde hair entered the room, smoothly opening the door and greeting his guests. Guy noted with displeasure that Kalia himself had invited them, but had not even bothered to wait for the guests, forcing them to wait themselves. However, Kalia, dressed in bright armor decorated with the Order's crest, did not respond to this comment. Closing the door behind him and smiling good-naturedly, Kalia noted that he needed time to clear his body and mind before the meeting. Guy grumbled, saying that it was the first time he had heard such nonsense. But Kalia, ignoring the rudeness, walked up to Roy and introduced himself. Roy tried to give his name in response out of politeness, but Kalia interrupted the guy, saying that he knew perfectly well who he was, and adding that he was very glad to meet them. Frowning, the guy decided to ask the question that was troubling him so much and find out how Kalia knew him. To which the guy smiled and boldly answered. He said that one of his disciples was present at the Academy tournament, and that was where they heard about Roy. Although the boy narrowed his eyes suspiciously, not believing these words at all. He asked why then such an important person suddenly wanted to meet him, since he was a simple newcomer. Having said that he had just wanted to talk about this, Kalia sat down on the sofa between the men and said that he wanted to offer them cooperation in exploring the dungeons. Raising his cup of tea and taking a modest sip, the boy continued that he really hoped to cooperate with the great swordsman. The man was already indignant, wanting to ask why the guy suddenly decided that he would agree. But Kalia interrupted him, claiming that the man himself knew that the end had not yet come. And these words made Guy fall into stunned silence, trying to make sure that he correctly understood what the guy meant. Taking another sip, Kalia said that they had recently received information that a distortion had appeared and was growing in one of the dungeons. Guy tried to protest again and say that it was nonsense, but Kalia interrupted the man again and said that the information was confirmed and they were obliged to find out more about the distortion. Sighing and turning his gaze to his interlocutor, the old man asked if this was the reason why the most famous religious figure had decided to come to their country. He suggested out loud that by using this distortion as a cover, Kalia was only trying to strengthen his position in this country. Smiling and taking another sip, the guy chuckled and said that he didn't even hope to fool the great swordsman, but he had to try. The old man noted that it was impudent to call this task a mission of the order, and then asked what Kalia could offer for help. To which Kalia himself smiled again. For some reason, he suddenly started talking about Guy's granddaughter and mentioned her academy, which threw the old man off track. The guy wanted to continue the topic and say that from the order's side they could help her, but Guy was already radiating his murderous, cruel aura. Feeling it, Roy realized that his body was numb, and earlier, apparently, the great swordsman did not use its full potential. Anger flared in Guy's eyes, and he said in a commanding, firm voice that Kalia had better never try to involve aura in her affairs again. Otherwise, the man would draw his blade. Smiling and seemingly not feeling the influence of the murderous aura, the boy calmly noted that he had made a mistake when he mentioned the swordsman's granddaughter. Humbly but calmly, the young man asked the old man for forgiveness, and Guy allowed his aura to fade. Realizing that in that case he had nothing more to give to the great swordsman, Kalia offered to fulfill any request Guy made as needed, just as he himself had asked. The old man chuckled, claiming that he could not and would not trust an empty word, to which Kalia said that he would swear by the name of the Order of Truth. At first, the swordsman hesitated for a few more minutes, but then he extended his hand and agreed to help Kalia if he gave an oath, and the deal between them was made. Having dealt with the great swordsman, Kalia finally turned to Roy and announced that they would now talk about him. Smiling and moving his hand out of the way for easy gesturing, Kalia told Roy bluntly that his order had a strong desire to sponsor the boy. Roy didn't understand at first and said that he was already sponsored by the academy. But Kalia noted that he was talking about compensation for those expenses that the academy did not take care of. Not trusting anything that is given for free, Roy asked directly what Kalia himself wanted in this case. But the guy laughed and kindly noted that it was absolutely selfless. Roy sincerely did not believe Kalia's words, not trusting his smile, and therefore suggested that he answer just one question, and then he would definitely think about his decision. Kalia agreed to answer the question without much hesitation, and Roy began. But at the same moment, he fell silent, doubting. Looking at the young man's suspicious smile, Roy thought that Kalia might try to avoid answering, and therefore he had to think of something else. Deciding to ask his question a little differently, the guy stood up from his seat and pulled his phone out of his back pocket. Roy quickly approached Kalia and held the phone out to him with the screen facing his face, which slightly confused the guy. With a confident smile, Roy asked if Kalia could see anything on his phone screen, intending to find out if the Order knew about the Transcendent Academy. To Roy's surprise, for the first time during their conversation, Sir Kalia stopped smiling and frowned at the screen of his phone, which was always turned off for everyone else. At this time, the guy's phone speakers were playing Buddha's difficult-to-understand thoughts, and the great god himself was displayed on the screen. Kalia noted incomprehensibly that Roy was asking very strange and incomprehensible questions, but the guy firmly continued to ask what exactly the young man saw. Roy said with a smile that he didn't think it was that difficult to answer the question, but Kalia replied that it was still difficult for him. Sighing, the guy took the phone away from Kalia's face and feigned disappointment, showing that he was saddened by the young man's refusal to answer. Seeing this, Kalia suddenly replied that he saw only a black screen, and Roy instantly removed all feigned emotions from his face, looking sternly into the eyes of his interlocutor. He tried to read the emotions on Kalia's face, but the young man began to smile again and, repeating that he had only seen a black screen, asked if the guy would be satisfied with such an answer. Having said that everything was fine with him, Roy smiled and responded to Kalia's offer of sponsorship with a firm, albeit polite, refusal. Sometime later, Kalia stood near a huge open window and, with his arms crossed over his chest, thoughtfully looked at the city from a great height. Without turning around, he spoke to the young man in the robe, asking how everything had gone for him. And the man replied that he had not found any distortions. Turning to the novice, Kalia sternly asked the man if he was sure of his words, which caused a stir in his mind, but he replied that he swears by the name of the order. Turning away and looking at the city again, Kalia noted to himself that there was nothing special about Roy, really, although his question caught the boy off guard. Biting his finger, Kalia wondered what that nagging feeling was that he felt in his own chest. The novice tried to say that he needed to go to another apostle, but Kalia forbade him, ordering him to simply observe for now and report back on what the other heroes had answered. Frowning with displeasure, the boy heard from the servant that he had called all the most legendary heroes, except for the Blade of Souls and the Sword of Darkness, who had not been seen for a long time. At the same time, when swordsmen and spearmen came out into the street, Guy asked Roy why he suddenly decided to refuse Kalia's sponsorship. The guy shrugged, thought for a moment, and then replied that the offer seemed suspicious to him, although Guy didn't understand what he was talking about. Guy indignantly asked why Roy had agreed to the offer to enroll in the Aura Academy, to which the guy replied that it inspired confidence. Deciding to change the subject, the guy reminded about what Guy and Kalia had discussed at the very beginning of the conversation and clarified what dungeon distortions were. The old man sighed and said that this was the name given to the distortion of magic within a dungeon, causing it to suddenly increase in difficulty or cause an unexpected breakthrough. The guy said he thought that such a thing was impossible, but Guy scratched his beard and replied that this used to happen all the time, although now it is rare. Roy, suddenly becoming agitated, clarified that Kalia meant that the times of the cataclysm had not yet ended, but Guy reassured him, claiming that the apostle was simply mistaken. The man turned and walked away, and Roy asked where he was going, since Aura Academy was in the other direction, and the old man said that he had things to do. The man walked away, but suddenly stopped and turned around with a menacing expression on his face, warning the boy not to do anything indecent with his granddaughter. Roy laughed, noting that the man had acknowledged the boy after all, and then sneered that it was because of this mistrust that Aura was angry at her grandfather, which angered the old man. Guy clenched his fists in rage, and Roy, seeing this and afraid that he was about to be beaten, turned around and ran to the academy. Grumbling about how he needed to get stronger quickly so he wouldn't have to fear the old man's threats, Roy returned to the academy and greeted Aura, who was surprised that the boy had returned so early. The girl was surprised when she noticed that her grandfather did not come with the guy, because they went together, and Roy replied that Guy suddenly had some business. Knowing her grandfather's character, Aura asked if he had said anything strange to the boy, to which he reassured her, assuring her that everything was fine. Still worried that Roy might have been intimidated, Aura once again sheepishly apologized for his character and for not warning the boy in advance. Shrugging his shoulders to the girl's surprise, Roy said that the great swordsman expressed himself very strictly and, in his opinion, incorrectly, but he could not say that he considered him bad. Scratching the back of his head, the spearman finished his sentence with a joke that if he somehow upset Guy, he would only get a few blows. He suddenly interrupted himself, indignant that he was talking nonsense. But the girl was already smiling sarcastically, hearing his words. Aura suddenly remembered that Roy needed money and emphasized it, although he did not understand how she found out, to which Aura replied that he shouted about it every day. Roy thought about how money really was his biggest problem, since all 100,000 had gone to pay for Joshua's treatment, and Aura picked up the phone. She said she had found a great task for Roy and handed him her phone, where he saw an ad for a dungeon clearing competition. Seeing that the competition organizers were offering the winner a whopping 300,000, Roy raised his eyebrows in shock, realizing how big of a sum that was. He asked the girl again what the competition was about, and Aura replied that apparently it would involve clearing dungeons that no one could handle. Roy had already thought that it would be very difficult, but the girl noted that most likely these were not profitable dungeons that were simply not paid attention to. Looking at the details of the ad with interest, the guy thought that she was right, because now hunters are only chasing profit and do not clean cheap dungeons. Aura also said that they contained weak monsters and sending professional hunters there was simply not practical. and Roy imagined a strong hunter and a weak goblin. The girl also noted that if the dungeons are not cleared quickly, they open up, releasing monsters into the cities, which is why the state came up with these competitions. Realizing how well thought out this system was, the guy thought about it and then said that he didn't know who came up with it, but he was a real genius. Aura, who sincerely wanted to help, asked if he agreed, and Roy, smiling, found no reason to refuse such a pleasant offer. And although the guy understood, among other things, that this competition would improve the Academy's rating, and that was precisely the reason Aura found out about it, he didn't want to upset her. When he turned away, the gears in his head started turning, giving the guy the understanding that since this was a competition, the opponents would be far from the weakest. He remembered how strong Joshua, whom the guy fought at the last tournament, was, and thought that he needed to be prepared for the fact that here he would meet someone clearly stronger. Frowning with displeasure and sitting down on the floor, the guy thought about how he could prepare so that his opponents wouldn't become a problem. The guy was grumbling to himself only because he really wanted to get the money, and he was still upset about being disqualified at the last competition. Roy asked Aura how the competition works, and she told him that at the beginning, all participants are sent the addresses of the dungeons, and then they are given a week to complete them. She also noted that a participant can reserve a dungeon, but unfortunately only one. And Roy thought that this was designed to avoid monopolization. Aura said that the reservation would be canceled in 10 hours, so we needed to clear as many dungeons as possible in a week. Roy said that the task was difficult because he would have to hurry and get rid of the corpses, and Aura asked in shock if he was really going to sell them. Roy was surprised and asked if getting rid of the monsters' corpses wasn't part of the main task, and Aura aggressively noted that it wasn't at all. Roy scratched his head and said that selling the corpses would make a lot of money, and the girl shook her head and replied that the main prize was much more important. A little disappointed that he wouldn't be able to both kill and sell monsters, Roy thought about how he could optimize his speed. Suddenly, he came up with an interesting idea and called out to Aura, who curiously asked what he had come up with. But before voicing the idea, the guy with a sly smile clarified what specific rules and restrictions there are in such a competition. A few days later, Roy was already prepared for the competition, and, getting ready for it, thoughtfully reviewed the progress of studying the lectures. At Aura's suggestion, the boy also downloaded a dungeon tracking app, and now they were waiting for the boy's assistant to show up. Aura asked if he might not be able to find his way, but Roy grinned and noted that this man would never allow himself to get lost. Finally seeing the one he had been waiting for quite some time, Roy waved to the